Eldon Bowen's life was never complete without a special lady in it.
Well, I think a woman is the best thing that God has ever created. Every man wants a woman in his life.
Twice widowed by age 55, the Virginia gentleman felt like a fish out of water when it came to dating.
I was very curious about ever getting involved with another woman. And, you know, I stayed single for a long time, but, you know, a man gets lonesome after a while.
By the winter of 2003, Eldon knew he was ready for a special someone, so he decided to ask a friend for some help.
And I said, you know, I got to find me a good woman, you know, somebody to spend my time with. And he said, well, I know a real nice lady. She's a churchgoer. I said, well, you know, how about introduce me?
Her name was Shirley Casara. Eldon wasted no time asking her out for coffee.
Well, when I first saw her, I said, damn, she's a tiny little thing. She was about 8 years older than me, but, you know, she was a very attractive lady.
And she was cute. She was. She was real petite, you know, real small, real soft-spoken.
I said, damn, you know, I said, this might be what I'm looking for.
As Eldon and Shirley got to know each other, they realized they had one thing in common. They had both been unlucky in love.
She told me that she'd been married 3 times. Well, she said her husband before me was a very mean and abusive person. Said they're always picking on her, pushing her, wouldn't let her do this, wouldn't let her do that, was very controlling.
The news threw Eldon for a loop.
I felt sorry for her. You know, I said, how can anybody be abusive to somebody this small and this fragile?
Before he knew it, Eldon was falling in love.
Our relationship was great, you know. I mean, you couldn't ask for anything better.
That Christmas Eve, Eldon and Shirley made it official. They were married in a quaint country chapel.
She was beautiful. She had on a nice suit. She looked fabulous to me. I was real happy that we got married and we went back home and we was teenagers again, you know.
Eldon was on cloud 9, and he was more than happy to give his new wife anything she wanted. So when Shirley asked that he add her name to the deed on his house, Eldon didn't hesitate to say yes, and he didn't stop there.
She had her checking account and I had mine. I said, well, I really don't want to get on your checking account. I said, but I would like to put you on mine, and that way you can pay the bills and stuff when I'm not here.
It seemed like a good idea at the time.
I loved her, and she was my wife. And if you ain't got love and trust in a marriage, then you don't have nothing.
But just 2 months later, Eldon began to see a whole new side of his sweet little wife.
Shirley, she started changing like a different person. And it was just almost like it was overnight.
It just seemed like the real her was coming out.
Shirley suddenly morphed from adorable to angry.
And she was screaming and yelling, cussing me, calling me everything in the world.
I told my dad that something wasn't right.
Who was Shirley Casara, really? It wouldn't be long before everyone would learn the disturbing truth.
I never thought you had to check somebody's record before you marry them.
You just don't think people are going to be like that, especially nice little old ladies.
By early 2005, Eldon Bowen was sure he'd hit the gold mine with his new wife, Shirley.
She was an excellent cook. She kept the house nice, and, you know, I couldn't ask for anything better.
But the honeymoon was short-lived. Just 2 months after saying I do, things quickly went downhill for the newlyweds.
Well, as soon as I put her name on the deed and one of my checking accounts, well, that's when she started changing.
My dad told me that they were arguing a little bit more and things weren't going right, and he told me that it just seemed like she was trying to start an argument, you know, over nothing.
You know, I come home one evening, you know, after having a beer with my friends, and to me it wasn't no big deal being 10, 20 minutes late. Well, she flew off the handle. She had supper on the stove, got mad, dumps everything in the sink. I said, well, maybe she's having a bad day, you know.
But Shirley's bad days quickly began to outnumber her good ones.
She would follow him around, even if he'd go out and get on the lawnmower and cut grass. She'd be walking beside the lawnmower fussing with him.
We're no bigger than what she was. She would get right up in your face. She had a temper. She would cuss when she was mad. But then she'd go to church on Sunday and everything was forgiven.
Eldon didn't know what to make of Shirley's bizarre mood swings. And as the weeks wore on, things just went from bad to worse.
We got in a heated discussion one day. I said, I really don't want to argue about it. So when I got out of the shower, she was gone.
Eldon got dressed and went outside, and that's when he got a nasty surprise. Someone had keyed his truck. Eldon suspected Shirley.
She got back, and I was a little hot about that.
Shirley flatly denied it and blamed the damage on neighborhood kids. But Eldon wasn't buying it.
We lived in a nice neighborhood, and I've never had no kids come in my driveway to do something like that. I said, yeah, some big damn kid with attitude.
Despite his misgivings, Eldon brushed the incident off. He could never have guessed what would happen just a few weeks later.
I was watching something on TV, and she would get in front of the TV, wanted to talk. I said, well, we can talk, but I'm not going to argue. Well, you think more about that blank TV than you do me. I said, well, at this point, yes, I do.
Frustrated, Eldon went outside to collect his thoughts. A few minutes later, he was surprised to see a patrol car turn into his driveway.
The cops got out of the car, and I said, no, what's going on? That's spousal abuse.
Eldon was flabbergasted. Shirley had called the cops and accused him of abusing her.
I said, well, what do you mean? I said, I've never raised a hand to her. Well, what she did, it looked like she took an earring or something like that, and she put a little scratch on her forearm.
Shirley's act was convincing. The officers put Eldon under arrest.
I said, for what? I said, I did nothing. I said, other than we've been arguing.
Police hauled a confused Eldon away to the local jail. Once there, they allowed him one phone call.
About 11 o'clock at night, my dad called me from Gloucester County Jail. Said that Shirley had him arrested. I asked him what for. He said she had him arrested on spousal abuse charges. I just knew he hadn't done anything to her.
Josh immediately posted bail, and the police let Eldon go. But they also slapped him with a restraining order.
They wouldn't let him go back to the house without an escort. So we met a couple of police officers. They followed us to the house. He got 15 minutes to go in, get his stuff, which was as much as he could grab, which at the time wasn't nothing but clothes. After we got all my dad's stuff, we stopped by the bank. So my dad gets some money out of the ATM.
And that's when Eldon's awful evening got even worse. He should have had more than $1,000 in the bank, but the money was gone.
Well, I had 78 cents in the bank, and I didn't know what was going on there. I said, I know there's got to be money there.
Confused and exhausted, Eldon called it a night. With nowhere else to go, he temporarily moved in with his son.
After a couple of days, I went to the credit union to find out why I didn't have no money.
And that's when Eldon found out just how devious Shirley had been.
They pull up my account, and then they pull up her account. The day before she arrested me, she went down and withdrew all the money except for 78 cents and transferred it from my account to her account. I said, well, that was pretty slick,
Several days later, Eldon went to court to answer for Shirley's charges of abuse. Despite his claims of innocence, the judge issued a 2-year protective order against him.
He wasn't to be within a certain distance of her or the property, which was his house, which was his property.
I wasn't allowed back in my own house that I purchased before I put her name on anything. I said, well, Johnny, if you're going to do that, I said, you might want to go ahead and make it a lifetime because I'm filing for divorce as soon as we walk out of here.
But leaving Shirley would not be easy. Eldon would soon realize he had completely underestimated his sweet little wife.
You're trying to hide. You don't have enough manhood in you. You low-lifed piece of nothing.
By late 2005, Eldon Bowen had been through the ringer thanks to his scheming wife, Shirley.
She got control of the house, she got control of the checking account, she got control of the money. I trusted her and I loved her. You know, and that was, I guess, my downfall.
By now, Eldon was living with his son and daughter-in-law after Shirley had kicked him out of his own home.
That really put a load on him. He was constantly telling Josh and I, you know, I'm sorry I have to stay here. You know, I'm sorry I have to depend on you. It was like shell shock for him.
Eldon was more than ready for a divorce, but the state of Virginia required a 12-month separation first. So while Eldon tried to get on with his life, Shirley seemed determined not to let him.
She would ride by the house at all hours of the night. We'd see her riding by.
She started ringing the phone constantly, up to 20 times a day. She would just ring the phone, ring the phone, ring the phone.
She tried to have 20 pizzas delivered to my house.
She was, you know, just all these things to just poke, poke, poke. Yes, I'm here, you know, I'm not leaving you alone.
First saved message.
She would call my dad knowing that she had a protection order against him.
Eldon, I'm trying to find out where you are. I don't know why we can't at least talk.
One time, he answered the phone, talked to her for a couple of minutes. She filed a charge against him for breaking the protection order when she called him.
Received October 18th. You're trying to hide. You're so damn by your family that you're afraid to even let them know that you care for your own wife.
I got stressed out. I think that's what she was trying to do. You know, I think she was trying to really stress me out. I've never been one to worry about small stuff, but you know, it took its toll on me.
You don't have enough manhood in you, you low-lifed piece of nothing.
Eldon did his best to ignore Shirley's bizarre behavior, but Shirley couldn't leave well enough alone. That spring, she made a devastating move.
A friend that introduced Shirley and I called me and told me that Shirley was getting rid of my stuff.
Everything he owned was in the house, and she had the protection order against him to where he couldn't be on that property.
All my possessions that I had, either she sold or she gave away. My boat's gone, my ATV's gone, all my tools. It was the most empty feeling I've ever had in my life because, you know, you get the shirt on your back and that's it. Everything's gone. I didn't even get a spoon.
The stress got the better of Eldon. He suffered a heart attack and lost his job.
That's when I started really getting depressed. And I've never been depressed my whole life. I had no idea Shirley was going to put me through what she did.
Finally, in May of 2006, after a year of separation, Eldon was able to file for divorce. But he never expected Shirley's reaction.
She just wouldn't sign any divorce papers. They had a deputy take them to her, she wouldn't sign them. They had the court subpoena her, she wouldn't sign them.
I said, okay, well, you know, if that's the way it's going to be, you know, we've been separated, going on a year now. Eventually, she might find somebody she wants to get serious with again, and she'll sign my divorce papers.
As difficult as it was, Eldon tried to put the whole miserable experience behind him.
That's when I just let everything go. I was ready to go on about my way and just rebuild my life again.
But a year later, disturbing rumors began swirling around town, and Eldon and his family realized their ordeal was far from over.
We heard that she was out with this other guy dancing, and she was talking about she was going to get married again. So we decided to just kind of start looking at public court records and found out she had gotten married again, and was in the process of trying to get a divorce.
Josh was shocked. Shirley had remarried while she was still legally married to Eldon.
I said, what in the world's going on here, you know? I said, I want my divorce first.
At his wit's end, Eldon went to see a detective.
I said, she never signed my divorce papers. I said, now what would that be? I said, wouldn't that be bigamy if she got remarried?
The detective pulled up Shirley's record and quickly realized this was much more than just a simple case of bigamy.
I was wondering how she was keeping it all secret.
It seemed there was much more to this little old lady than anyone could have imagined.
There was investigations into bigamy, perjury, and financial crimes.
Shirley seems to have perfected her scam over the years.
If you have a story of marriage gone wrong and would like to appear on this series, go to investigation.discovery.com. By the winter of 2007, it was becoming clear that Shirley Cassara was not at all who she seemed.
Shirley looked like a very sweet, older lady. She sure did. But her looks were definitely deceiving.
Investigators discovered that Shirley's past was littered with a string of husbands, some of them overlapping.
I found out, you know, that she was still married when we got married. And I found out that she had remarried after me, divorced him, and then got remarried again.
My dad thought she had only been married like 4 times. That's what was on their marriage certificate, but we find out that it's been actually 10 times she was married.
Eldon had been Shirley's 8th husband, not her 4th as she'd claimed.
I felt then that this was a game that she was playing. It made me right disturbed.
But that wasn't all. When investigators interviewed Shirley's 10th husband, his tale sounded eerily familiar.
Prior to this, he'd been married for 32 years. His wife passed away. And he was lonely, and he met Shirley online. Once they were married, within 4 days, she was already calling the sheriff's office here in Gloucester and reporting that he is assaulting her.
While husband number 10 was in jail, Shirley wiped out his bank account. And husband number 7 claims the same thing happened to him, too.
Shirley found gentlemen, started dating them, and eventually marrying them. Once they were married is when her attitude would change, and that's when the allegations of domestic violence would start. The husbands would be arrested. Protective orders would be obtained. She managed to get her name put on properties, onto bank accounts, and she would completely clean them all out.
By 2010, after a 2-year investigation, detectives in 3 different counties had assembled a thick file on Shirley. Her crimes ran the gamut: embezzlement, bigamy, and fraud.
Shirley was somebody you look at and think grandma. It was very shocking.
Shirley was arrested on July 15th, 2010.
Made me feel good. It really made me feel good. What she done, she put me in such a bind. You know, after losing my job, losing my house, getting stressed out, going half crazy. You know, what she did was wrong.
In April 2011, after a trial that was the talk of the town,
That is the meanest little woman that I have ever encountered in my life.
Shirley was sentenced to 1 year in jail for bigamy. In July of that same year, she was sentenced to another year for embezzlement. She became known as the gold-digging grandma in the local community.
I don't think Shirley could love anybody but herself. Her only equal in life was when she looked in the mirror. Everybody else, he was just an object.
Today, Eldon lives in a small apartment close to his son, daughter-in-law, and his beloved grandkids. He has plans to file a civil suit against Shirley in the future and hopes to recoup some of what he lost.
I may never get it all back, but it will be nice to get some, if not most of it back.
He's also taken on another mission: to warn unsuspecting men about Shirley's schemes.
As far as Shirley goes, the only thing I can say, guys, watch out, because she hasn't stopped. She's probably already got pen pals in prison.
Eldon readily admits he's not too sure about dating again. But then again, there are plenty of fish in the sea.
But there's a lot of single women in here my age. And I flirt with them and I talk to them. But I don't know if I could ever marry one or not, you know.
Dallas native Diane Reeve had always been a fighter.
I believe very strongly in indomitable spirit, and that means you never quit, you never give up.
But when her 18-year marriage ended in 2000, the 50-year-old martial arts teacher and mother of two was ready to give up on love.
And my friends convinced me that I was too young and too vibrant to do that, and they suggested that I use the internet. I was one of those people that would never have thought that I would have turned to the internet. I'm just the dumb jock that teaches karate.
But in the winter of 2001, Diane agreed to give online dating a whirl. She went on several dates, but screening these men was an awful lot of work.
I kind of call myself the queen of the one-date wonders. I'd go out with them and it would be like, no.
Frustrated, Diane began to wonder if she should give up. Until one day in January 2002, when she received a message from a French martial arts enthusiast named Philippe Padieu.
He seemed to be a little exotic. He was not your typical cowboy Texas, rootin' tootin' kind of dude.
Philippe was nice looking. He's tall and he's dark and he's handsome. He has the French accent, so that's always kind of intriguing.
Then finally, I agreed to go out with him.
That February, Diane and Philippe had their first date. And it seemed like the stars were aligning.
We had a lot of fun. He entertained me, told me a lot of stories about his life. I did like the fact that he was open with me. He didn't seem to hold anything back. He didn't seem to be hiding anything.
Before long, Diane and Philippe were seeing each other on a regular basis. And after a few months, Diane found herself embroiled in a passionate physical relationship as well.
I told him, I said, look, I'm not seeing anybody else. And if you are, that's okay. I just need to know that, because if you're seeing other people, then we need to be using condoms.
But Philippe assured Diane she was the only woman in his life.
So at that point, the relationship went to the next level.
Diane was ecstatic. Philippe seemed to be everything she wanted.
I felt like we were connecting so well. I thought we started to build a life together.
But just a few years later, everything unraveled, and Diane found herself facing the most terrifying ordeal of her life. By the winter of 2007, Diane and Philippe had weathered their share of ups and downs. But nothing could have prepared Diane for what she discovered that January. It all started with a strange voicemail.
I got a voicemail on Philippe's phone, and I couldn't understand why anybody would have my name for that phone number. I called my best friend and said, I got this weird phone call.
The message didn't seem to make sense, and Diane was certain it was a prank.
And she said, yeah, it's a joke. Somebody's messing with you.
But the joke was devastatingly real, and 2 days later, Diane would find herself facing the toughest fight of her life.
My knees hit the floor. I don't remember anything after that for a couple hours. No recollection.
It seemed Philippe had been deceiving her in the worst possible way.
I think he's a predator in a real screwed up sort of way.
In the winter of 2002, 5 years before the most traumatic phone call of her life, Diane Reeve was glowing. Close friends suspected Philippe Padieu, her boyfriend of 1 year, had something to do with it.
Philippe was always very attentive to her. He was incredibly good at compliments. And he made her feel on top of the world, and you could tell.
But that Christmas, the happy couple got some bad news. Philippe was being laid off from his job as a network analyst. It was a tough blow, so Diane was determined to do whatever she could to help the man she loved.
I did pay for a cell phone for him. I helped with health insurance and groceries and dinners and going out to eat.
Diane also agreed to let Philippe teach some classes at her school.
I was in love with Philippe. It didn't bother me at all to help him.
So in the fall of 2005, when Philippe began complaining about pain in his back and groin, Diane insisted he go see a doctor, and she even wrote him a check to cover the cost.
He had told me stories before about having had kidney stones.
The doctor didn't find any kidney stones, but he did run a panel of tests for STDs.
So I said, well, what were the results? And he said, well, I won't get the results for about a week.
Philippe claimed the tests were just a precaution. But the following week, the doctor's office called and asked that Philippe come in for his results.
That's when I panicked. I knew that that wasn't a good sign. If test results are negative, they tell you over the phone. And I said, well, I want to go with you. And he said, no, I don't want you to go to the doctor's office with me. I'm a big boy, I can do this.
But Diane was insistent. The day of Philippe's appointment, she drove to the doctor's office and waited in the parking lot.
Finally, after what seemed to be an eternity, he comes out of the building, walks up to the car, and I roll down the window. How are the test results? Everything's fine. I said, all your tests are negative? He said, yep, all my tests are negative. And I'm like, whew. I thought this particular doctor just wants to be extra careful, and they called him in to give him negative test results.
Life for the couple carried on as usual. But for Diane's close friends, there was cause for concern.
I just didn't know that this was good for her. I didn't know if it was a safe relationship. I was concerned that he was busy with the world, maybe other women.
1 month later, those suspicions were confirmed when Diane stopped by the martial arts school on her way home from a night out. Philippe's car was in the parking lot, so Diane went inside to look for him.
And as I made my way around to the private lesson room, I noticed that the door was closed. And I was calling his name. He opened the door and walked my entrance into the private lesson room.
But Philippe wasn't fast enough. Diane had already spied a woman's purse in the room.
I knew that she was behind the door, and so I slammed that door open as hard as I could. She left really in a hurry. She's lucky she got out of there.
Diane was furious, and Philippe fell apart. He swore nothing had happened, so Diane decided to give him the benefit of the doubt.
I had a lot invested in him. We had a lot of time together, and I wanted it to work.
But just 2 months later, on the day of her daughter's wedding, Diane was betrayed yet again.
He called me and said, I'm not feeling well. Just go on to the party without me.
Diane went ahead and went to the dinner and then went by his house. And that's when she knew that something was up.
There was nobody at the house. At that point in time, I knew it was over.
Diane couldn't help but wonder, had Philippe been honest about anything?
That's probably one of the things that really broke her heart.
The answer to that question was deadly serious.
This was someone who actually knew that he could be killing these women, and he didn't care.
By June 2006, Diane Reeve was ready to be rid of her philandering boyfriend, Philippe Padieu. The couple had been together 4 years, And now, Diane found herself wondering how many lies Philippe had told.
Since I was paying for his cell phone, checked his voicemail messages, not one but two women setting up times to be together.
It was a bitter pill to swallow, but things were about to get even worse.
On the Monday after we broke up, I had my annual physical and found I had human papillomavirus. And not only did I have HPV, but I also had some precancerous cells.
HPV is a sexually transmitted disease that can lead to cancer. Diane knew Philippe had given it to her.
I hadn't been with anybody else in 4.5 years. So I thought, well, you know what? If he gave it to me, then he's probably given it to at least 2 other women that I know he's been with.
Knowing she had a duty to warn these women, Diane pulled Philippe's cell phone records and started dialing. She was stunned by what she discovered.
I found 9 other women that he had been seeing, and that was just the ones that I found in the last 2 months. How did you juggle that many women?
The violation of trust was staggering, and 7 months later, Diane found out how dangerous Philippe's indiscretions had really been. By January 2007, Diane was having serious health issues. She had undergone surgery to remove the precancerous cells, but the cells were still growing.
Diane was starting to be very tired, feeling run down, which is very un-Diane-like.
And I couldn't understand why. I'd never been that way before. I always had a lot of energy.
Everyone was concerned, and the explanation would be devastating. The afternoon of January 23rd, Diane noticed there was a voicemail on Philippe's cell phone. The message was for her, and it was from the Dallas County Health Department.
And I couldn't understand why the health department would be calling me on Philippe's phone.
At first, Diane thought it must be a joke.
And I called the number back, and they answered the phone, Dallas County Health Department, and I knew it wasn't a joke.
Terrified, Diane hung up.
I scrolled back through on his phone. The last person that I had talked to was Susan.
Susan was one of the women Diane had called to warn about HPV. Susan had broken up with Philippe in December and had taken a panel of STD tests.
I just called her and I said, I just got a call from the health department. What can you tell me about that? And she said, we need to talk. And somehow I knew. Before she even said the words HIV, everything crashed in on me. And I knew.
3 weeks earlier, Susan had tested positive for HIV.
And the health department contacts the person and asks them to give names of people who might be exposed. She gave the health department Philippe's name, and she gave my name.
Diane immediately went in for a test.
And 2 days later, got a phone call from my OBGYN. And she said, Diane, I have your test results and you're HIV positive. And my knees hit the floor.
Further testing yielded even more devastating news. Diane's illness had progressed to AIDS.
Her immediate reaction was she had been given a death sentence.
So I started to tell my family, and I called Susan Beth and told her that my results were positive too.
Susan had already given Philippe the bad news and notified him that the health department would be calling. His reaction was unsettling.
And he goes, what? You gave my name to the health department? And it wasn't, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry you have HIV. It wasn't, oh my gosh, I might have been exposed to HIV. It was anger about her giving his name to the health department.
Philippe was strangely cavalier about Susan's diagnosis, as if he had known all along.
And that made her very suspicious.
What did Philippe know? And when did he know it?
We started to get angry pretty early on We knew something was wrong.
I think he's just disgusting. He's a predator.
We knew we had to stop him.
If you have a story of marriage gone wrong and would like to appear on this series, go to investigation.discovery.com. In February 2007, Diane Reeve was fighting for her life. She had contracted AIDS from her philandering boyfriend, Philippe Padieu.
I knew it was from Philippe. Hadn't been with anybody else.
Even worse, Philippe seemed strangely unsurprised by the news.
We had suspicions that he had known that he was positive for some period of time, that this was no accident.
Determined to fight back, Diane enlisted the help of Susan, one of Philippe's exes who had also been diagnosed with HIV. Together, the two women paid a visit to the local PD.
When we met with the detective, he said, you know, this is going to be a pretty difficult case because it's precedent setting. If we have 2 people file charges, then that's better. If we have more than 2 people, then we'll make a case. So we went to work.
Diane and the other women were very instrumental in finding other people who had been exposed to this.
I pulled cell phone records again, and we started calling people to let them know that they needed to get tested for HIV.
The calls resulted in 3 more women finding out that they too had been infected with HIV. For Diane, putting Philippe behind bars became a matter of life and death.
I was very determined to make sure that he didn't hurt anybody else.
Diane and Susan were soon joined by Megan, another HIV-positive victim of Philippe's.
Megan noticed that there were cars in Philippe's driveway every night, so she started writing down the license tag numbers. I had a friend who could run the plates, and we would track down the women and then either call them or pay them a visit.
On February 22nd, the 3 women had Philippe served with a court order from the health department. The mandate was clear: disclose, use protection, or abstain.
And he had to sign that document. There was a car in his driveway that night and the next night after that, and he had not disclosed, used protection, or refrained, because we talked to those women. At that point, I began to see the evil, and it really started to frighten me.
This is someone who actually knew that he could be killing these women. He was, at the minimum, causing serious bodily injury by reckless conduct.
As evidence against Philippe mounted, Diane remembered another key detail that would help seal his fate. That 2005 doctor's visit, ostensibly for kidney stones.
And some light bulb went off in my head, and I thought, could it have been that he really did know that he was HIV positive that day? Could that really be possible?
Diane immediately informed the police, who subpoenaed Philippe's test results.
The medical records indicated that he had been informed that he was HIV positive.
It was the nail in the coffin. In July 2007, Philippe was arrested at a Texas nightclub. He was charged with 6 counts of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon.
The indictment alleged a serious bodily injury by transmitting the HIV virus through bodily fluids, which was alleged as being the deadly weapon.
In May 2009, 6 HIV-positive women testified against Philippe at trial. When the verdict was read, Diane, Susan, and Megan were all present.
We stood and held hands as they read each guilty verdict. 6 guilties.
Philippe was sentenced to 45 years for 5 counts. He received 25 years for 1 count, Diane's.
Philippe never admitted guilt. Philippe tried to blame everybody except for himself. You know, it was anybody's fault but his fault.
It hasn't been an easy road for Diane, who had to overcome a mountain of health issues because of Philippe's betrayals. But ultimately, the fighter in her prevailed.
I'm doing better. Not normal, but better than when I was diagnosed. The medicine is wonderful. It keeps the virus from growing and it keeps you from feeling sick, but there's a lot of pills involved.
Diane has coped through all of this because to do anything less is not how Diane is. Somebody with 4 different black belts, doesn't go down without a fight.
Today, Diane can still be found at her martial arts academy, living and teaching a hard-won message.
No matter whether life knocks you down, you have to get right back up.
The neon pulse of 1992 Tokyo was a fevered dream of excess and shadow, a city caught between the glittering peak of the bubble era and the looming precipice of a lost decade. In the heart of Shinjuku, the lights never truly dimmed, casting long, distorted shadows across the rain-slicked pavement where millions of souls drifted like ghosts in a concrete sea. Among them was Akari Tanaka, a 20-year-old university student with a bright future and a smile that seemed to defy the cynical gravity of the metropolis. She was there, and then, in the blink of a shutter, she was gone. No struggle, no scream, just a void where a human life used to be. For 34 years, her name was a whisper in the archives of the Metropolitan Police, a yellowing photograph on a missing flyer that the wind had long since torn away. The case was cold, frozen beneath the weight of 3 decades of silence, until the earth itself decided to give up its dead. It began with the screech of heavy machinery and the grind of iron against ancient soil. The landmark Star Shinjuku Plaza, a massive geometric monument that had stood as a symbol of the city's resilience, was being dismantled for a modern transit hub. The workers expected rebar, pipes, and the remnants of a forgotten subway line. They didn't expect the hollow sound of a hidden cavity beneath the primary support pillar. When the drill bit cracked the reinforced concrete, a scent wafted out that froze the blood of every man on the site, the heavy, cloying stench of a tomb that had been sealed for an eternity. Beneath 3 meters of solid stone, encased in a makeshift sarcophagus of industrial-grade plastic and lye, lay the remains, not a skeleton, but a preservation of horror. The lime had done its work, but the cold, anaerobic environment of the foundation had kept the truth intact. A shock of dark hair, a gold locket, a university ID card, the plastic cracked, but the face still visible, staring back from 1992 with eyes that had seen the end of the world. The news hit the airwaves like a seismic shock, a cold case suddenly screaming back to life with the violence of a fresh wound. Tokyo stared at its screens in a collective, shivering silence. The missing student wasn't lost in the crowd. She was beneath their feet. Every person who had met for a coffee at the plaza, every couple who had kissed by the monument, every businessman who had hurried past to catch the last train. They had all been treading on a grave. The community was rocked to its core. How could a body be buried under a major public landmark during its construction? How could the killers move to the most surveyed city on earth with a corpse and a bucket of quickset cement? The investigation didn't just reopen. It exploded into a hunt for a ghost who had spent 30 years hiding in plain sight. Forensics moved in with the precision of surgeons, peeling back the layers of time with lasers and swabs. The autopsy revealed a story of calculated cruelty. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a structural execution. The cause of death, manual strangulation, followed by a post-mortem ritual that suggested the killer knew exactly how the city was built. They didn't just want her dead. They wanted her to become part of the city's very bones. The locket she wore was pried open to reveal a single, handwritten note, the ink blurred by moisture, but the message clear. The city will keep you. It was a taunt from the past, a chilling signature of a predator who understood that in Tokyo, the best place to hide a secret is right in the middle of the light. Detective Hiroshi Sato, a man who was a rookie when Akari first vanished and was now weeks away from retirement, stood behind a yellow tape, his breath hitching in the cold morning air. He remembered the mother's face. He remembered the father's broken voice. For him, this wasn't just a discovery, it was a haunting. He began tracing construction logs from 1992, digging through the digital dust of companies that no longer existed and names that had been scrubbed by time. He found a discrepancy, a missing 48-hour window in the concrete pouring schedule of the Star Shinjuku. A window where the security cameras had malfunctioned and a specific crew of subcontractors had been dismissed early, replaced by a specialized team that left no paper trail. The trail led to a labyrinth of high-level corruption and shadows. In the early 90s, the construction industry was a playground of the Yakuza and the elite, a world where money flowed like water and human life was often treated as a disposable commodity. Witnesses began to emerge, old men in nursing homes who spoke in terrified whispers about a man in the gray coat who frequented the site, a man who was an engineer but held more power than the foreman. Manhoy K.Y. La. Strange clues started surfacing. A vintage pager found in the debris, containing a single recurring code, a series of bank transfers from a shell company to a private account in Switzerland, timed perfectly with the date of Akari's disappearance. The mystery wasn't just about murder. It was about a conspiracy that reached into the very heart of the Tokyo establishment. As the DNA results confirmed the identity, the public's fascination turned into a feverish demand for justice. The missing student was no longer a statistic. She was a daughter of Japan, a symbol of a generation's lost innocence. The media descended on the old apartment where her parents still lived, their lives frozen in a state of perpetual waiting. The father, now frail and silver-haired, stood before the cameras, his voice a low, rhythmic thrum of grief. "We didn't want her found like this," he said, "but the earth is more honest than men." His words echoed across the nation, a stinging indictment of society that had moved on while his daughter was trapped in a pillar of stone. The investigation hit a wall of silence when it reached the upper echelons of the defunct construction firm. Records had been burned in a fortuitous fire in 1995. The lead foreman had died of a sudden heart attack years ago. It seemed the killer had systematically pruned the branches of the past to ensure the truth remained buried. But they forgot one thing, the digital age. A group of amateur sleuths and open source investigators began cross-referencing old news footage from the monument's dedication ceremony in 1993. In the background of one frame, standing behind the mayor, was a man whose face sent a chill through the internet. He was wearing a gray coat. He was looking not at the cameras, but at the spot where the body had just been found. The image was enhanced, the pixels sharpened by AI until a name emerged, Kenzo Mori, a man who had built half of Shinjuku before vanishing into the world of private security and political consulting. He was the fixer, the man who made problems disappear. But as Detective Sato tracked Mori's current location, he found a mansion on the outskirts of the city that was a fortress of silence. Mori hadn't fled. He was waiting. When the police breached the gates, they found a man who looked like he had been expecting them for 30 years. He sat in a traditional tea room, a single photograph on the table in front of him, not his family, but of Akari Tanaka taken on the night she died. The interrogation was a psychological war of nerves. Mori didn't deny it. He didn't confess. He spoke in riddles about the price of progress and the necessity of sacrifice. He claimed he was merely a tool, a hand guided by forces far more powerful than a simple detective. "You found the body," he whispered, his eyes devoid of any human warmth. "But you will never find the reason. Some secrets are built into the foundation because if they were removed, the whole city would crumble." It was a chilling admission of a systemic darkness, a hint that Akari wasn't a random victim, but a witness to something so massive it required her permanent silence. The standoff between the law and the ghosts of the bubble era reached a breaking point. The public demanded a trial, a spectacle of accountability, but the legal system was tangled in statutes of limitations and missing evidence. Yet the evidence of the body, the silent witness from 1992, was undeniable. Forensic experts found microscopic traces of a very specific, high-end perfume on Akari's clothing, a scent that was only available to the elite in the early 90s. It wasn't Mori's scent. It was a woman's. The plot twisted again, spiraling into a narrative of jealousy, power, and a high society cover-up that used Mori as its brutal architect. The revelation that a prominent figure, now a leader in humanitarian efforts, might have been the catalyst of the murder sent the country into a tailspin. The contrast between the pristine image of the landmark and the rotting truth beneath it became a metaphor for the city itself. The investigation revealed that Akari had stumbled upon a secret meeting, a clandestine deal that would have destroyed the reputations of Tokyo's most powerful families. She was a collateral damage of a new era. The cold case was solved in name, but the sense of justice was hollow. The perpetrators were either dead, too powerful to touch, or shielded by the very concrete they had used to hide their sins. As the sun sets over the modern skyline of Shinjuku, the space where the monument once stood is now a gaping hole in the earth, a wound that refuses to heal. The flowers left by strangers are piled high against the construction fences, a colorful tribute to a girl who was lost for a lifetime. The echo of the 1992 cold case remains a haunting reminder that the ground we walk on is never truly silent. The city continues to grow, higher and faster, but beneath the glass and steel, the ghosts of the past still breathe, waiting for the next shovel to hit the stone, for the next secret to be dragged into the light. The case is closed, but the nightmare is eternal, a permanent stain on the neon soul of Tokyo. The silence of the interrogation room was not empty. It was heavy, suffocating, a vacuum that seemed to suck the oxygen from Detective Sato's lungs. Across the table, Kenzo Mori sat like a stone carving, his presence a chilling bridge to a Tokyo that was supposed to have vanished with the 1990s. The fixer didn't move, didn't blink, but his words hung in the air like a death sentence. Some secrets are built into the foundation. The investigation had shifted from a search for a body to a descent into a subterranean world of power. Every file Sato pulled, every lead he followed, felt like pulling a thread on a tapestry that covered a gaping hole in the nation's history. The perfume, that haunting, expensive scent found on Akari's collar, was the key. It was a vintage fragrance, L'Ambre Dawn Low, a luxury item that in 1992 was exclusive mark of the Ginza elite. This wasn't the smell of a construction site. It was the smell of a palace. Outside, the city was in a state of high-octane frenzy. The Shinjuku sarcophagus had become the top trending topic globally. Amateur detectives on the dark web were cross-referencing Akari's social circles with the guest list of high society galas from 3 decades ago. A name began to circulate, whisper at first, then shouted across forums. Sayuri Ishida. Today, she was a titan of philanthropy, the mother of the marginalized. But in 1992, she was the heiress to the Ishida conglomerate, the very company that had funded the Star Shinjuku project. The connection was a lightning bolt. If the Ishida family was involved, the burial of Akari Tanaka wasn't just a murder. It was an industrial operation. The landmark wasn't a monument to the city's future. It was a $500 million headstone designed to keep a secret from ever breathing again. Sato felt the pressure from above almost immediately. His phone rang with anonymous calls from the Ministry of Land and Infrastructure, suggesting that the investigation focus on Mori and close the book on the girl's tragic end. They wanted a scapegoat, a lone wolf in the criminal underworld. Not a scandal that could topple a dynasty. But the forensic evidence was screaming. Under a high-power microscope, the gold locket found on Akari revealed more than just a note. Stuck in the hinge was a microscopic fiber, not from Akari's cheap student blazer, but a thread of rare hand-woven silk, dyed in a shade of indigo used only by the most exclusive tailors in Kyoto. The net was tightening around the untouchables. As the rain lashed against the windows of the Metropolitan Police Department, a courier delivered an unmarked envelope to Sato's desk. Inside was a single Polaroid photograph, dated November 14, 1992, the night Akari disappeared. It showed a dimly lit VIP lounge in a Roppongi club. In the background, blurry but unmistakable, was Akari Tanaka. She looked terrified, her hand gripped firmly by a woman whose face was turned away, but who wore a distinctive, custom-made silk kimono in that same rare indigo. In the foreground, Kenzo Mori stood like a sentinel, his hand resting on the hilt of a concealed weapon. The photo was a confession in silver halide. Akari hadn't just stumbled onto a deal. She had been taken as a guest to a meeting where the future of Tokyo was being carved up like a carcass. The cold case was no longer a mystery. It was a war. Sato knew that if he moved too slowly, the evidence would evaporate. He bypassed the superiors and coordinated a midnight raid on the Ishida estate, a fortress of traditional architecture hidden behind high walls in Denin-Chofu. The atmosphere was electric, the air crackling with the tension of a final confrontation. as the police vehicles tore through the quiet streets. The contrast was jarring. The high-tech sirens of 2026 echoing against the silent, stagnant wealth of the 90s. When they breached the gates, they didn't find a fleeing criminal. They found Sayuri Ishida in her garden, watching the koi swim in a pond that cost more than a common man's life. She didn't look up. She simply said, "The concrete was supposed to last 100 years. You've ruined the architecture of my silence." The arrest was a cinematic explosion of flashbulbs and chaos. The mother of the marginalized in handcuffs was an image that shattered the national psyche. The community, already reeling from the discovery of the body, was now forced to confront the rot at the top. The Manhoy KY law's strange clues began to make sense. The Swiss bank transfers weren't for a bribe. They were the pension for construction crew silence, a lifetime of hush money paid out by a shell company. But as the interrogation of Ishida began, the story took a darker, more personal turn. It wasn't just about business. It was about a shadow life. Akari Tanaka had been the illegitimate daughter of Sayuri's father, a secret heir who threatened the entire Ishida succession. The murder was a cleaning of the bloodline, a sacrifice at the altar of corporate purity. In the depths of the precinct, the two worlds finally collided. Mori, the brutal enforcer, and Ishida, the elegant mastermind, were brought face to face in the hallway. No words were exchanged, but the look that passed between them, a mixture of ancient loyalty and mutual destruction, was a testament to the darkness they had shared for 34 years. The legal battle that followed was a labyrinth of technicalities, but the missing student had her own way of fighting back. Forensics discovered that Akari had left one final clue, something the lime and the concrete couldn't destroy. Etched into the back of her university ID card with fingernail, visible only under ultraviolet light, were 3 sets of coordinates. They didn't point to the plaza. They pointed to 3 other landmarks built by the Ishida conglomerate across Japan. The realization sent a wave of horror through the task force. The star Shinjuku wasn't a unique grave. It was a prototype. If the coordinates were correct, the Ishida legacy wasn't built on steel and glass, but on a foundation of the disappeared. The missing student was just the one they found. A nationwide cold case alert was issued, and the sound of drills began to echo in cities from Osaka to Sapporo. The shock to the community was no longer local, it was existential. People looked at the bridges they crossed, the towers they worked in, and wondered who was sleeping in the stone. The Tokyo 1992 case had cracked the surface, and what was pouring out was an ocean of unresolved grief and hidden crimes. Sato, his retirement papers sitting ensigned on his desk, stood at the edge of the Shinjuku pit one last time. The excavation was ongoing, the lights of the construction cranes cutting through the midnight fog like searchlights in a dream. He thought of Akari's mother, who had died years ago without ever knowing the truth. He thought of the girl, trapped in the dark for 3 decades while the city roared above her, indifferent and glittering. Justice was coming, but it was a cold, hard justice that offered no comfort. The solved tag on the file felt like a lie. How can a case be solved when the motive is as vast as the city itself? As part 2 of this nightmare drew to a close, the high society mastermind sat in her cell, her silk kimono replaced by a gray jumpsuit, yet her poise remained unbroken. She knew something the police were only beginning to suspect. The coordinates Akari had scratched into her ID weren't just graves. They were a map to a hidden ledger, a black book of the 1990s elite that contained the names of every politician, judge, and CEO who had ever asked Kenzo Mori to make a problem disappear. The hunt for the killer had become a hunt for the soul of the nation. The atmosphere was no longer just tense. It was apocalyptic. The next chapter wouldn't be about a trial. It would be about the collapse of a system that thought it could bury the truth in the foundations of the world. The neon lights of Shinjuku flickered, a glitch in the matrix of the city. The rain continued to fall, washing the dust of the excavation into the gutters. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed, a lonely sound that seemed to cry out for all the souls who were still waiting to be found. The landmark was gone, the girl was found, but the ghost of 1992 was just getting started. The echo of the drill was the only heartbeat the city had left, a rhythmic reminder that beneath the pavement, the past is never truly dead. It's just waiting for someone to dig. The sound of the hydraulic drill didn't just break the pavement of the Tenjin Bridge in Osaka. It shattered the last remnants of Japan's collective denial. This was no longer a localized tragedy in Shinjuku. It was a national autopsy. The coordinates Akari Tanaka had scratched into her ID card with her dying breath led the task force to 3 separate prefectures, each a cornerstone of the Ishida conglomerate's industrial empire. As the sun rose over the Yodo River, the world watched via drone feeds and news helicopters, a silent, shivering audience witnessing the excavation of a bridge that had been a symbol of modern engineering for 3 decades. Detective Sato stood on the edge of the cordoned-off zone, his coat flapping in the freezing wind, his eyes fixed on the point where the drill bit met the reinforced steel. The vibration hummed through the soles of his boots, a rhythmic, haunting pulse that felt like the heartbeat of a buried era. When the concrete finally buckled, revealing a hollowed-out section of the primary pylon, the reaction was instantaneous. The workers backed away, their faces turning ashen under their hard hats. There, encased in the same industrial lye and plastic that had preserved Akari, was a second set of remains. This wasn't a student. The forensic team pulled a rotted leather satchel from the cavity, its contents a time capsule of 1994. Inside were microfilms, a cassette recorder, and a press badge for Kaito Sora, an investigative journalist who had vanished while looking into structural irregularities in the Ishida contracts. The missing student case had just evolved into something far more predatory, a systematic purge of anyone who dared to look behind the curtain of the bubble era's prosperity. The community was no longer just shocked. It was terrified. If a journalist and a student could be turned into structural support for the city's infrastructure, who else was missing? The cold case was now a serial execution investigation, and the architect of this concrete graveyard was still sitting in an interrogation room in Tokyo, smiling at the ceiling. Kenzo Mori, the fixer, wasn't just a killer. He was a high priest of a modern Haido Bashira, the ancient practice of human sacrifice to ensure the stability of a building. Except this time, the gods being appeased weren't spirits of the earth, but the titans of the Japanese economy. The pressure on Sato intensified to a breaking point. The Ministry of Justice was receiving frantic calls from international investors. The Ishida stock was in a free fall, wiping out billions in hours. Shut it down was the order from the top. Identify the bodies, but stop the excavations. But Sato knew he couldn't stop. The third set of coordinates pointed to a luxury residential tower in the heart of Sapporo, a building that housed some of the most powerful families in the northern prefecture. To drill, there would be to declare war on the elite. Yet, the public was now a hungry beast, fed by the Manhoi KY law, strange clues, leaking from the dark web. A digital underground of activists began mapping every Ishida project built between 1988 and 1996, creating a grave map of the country. The mystery was a wildfire, and the wind was blowing straight toward the halls of Parliament. Back in Tokyo, the interrogation of Sayuri Ishida took a chilling turn. She sat in the sterile light of the precinct, her presence radiating a cold, aristocratic defiance. "You think you are finding victims, detective," she whispered, her voice like silk over a blade. "But you are only finding the price of the ground you stand on. Do you think Tokyo became a global superpower through honesty? We built this world on the silence of the unnecessary. Akari Tanaka was a mistake of my father's blood, a loose end in a world that requires perfect knots. Her confession wasn't an admission of guilt, but a lecture on the philosophy of power. She spoke of the Black Book, a ledger that Mori had kept, a detailed record of every sacrifice made to keep the Ishida Empire standing. This book wasn't just a list of names. It was a map of the nation's corruption. It contained the signatures of those who had authorized the disappearances, the men who had looked the other way while the concrete was poured over the living. Sato realized that the Black Book was the only thing that could prevent the case from being buried once again. But Mori had hidden it well. In a rare moment of vulnerability, Mori leaned across the table and whispered a single phrase to Sato. "The foundation is only as strong as the secret it holds. If you want the book, you have to go back to the beginning, where the light meets the first stone." The riddle was a taunt, a final game from a man who knew he was destined for the gallows. Sato returned to the star Shinjuku site, now a hollowed-out crater in the earth. He walked the perimeter of the pit at 3 a.m., the neon signs of the surrounding skyscrapers casting long, bleeding shadows into the mud. He realized that the first stone wasn't the monument itself, but the cornerstone of the very first project Mori and Ishida had collaborated on, a small, nondescript memorial park in the suburbs dedicated to the unknown workers of the city. As the task force descended on the memorial park, the air was thick with the scent of ozone and impending rain. They didn't need heavy machinery this time. The site was neglected, overgrown with weeds that seemed to choke the life out of the stone. Beneath a plaque that read, "In silence, we build the future," Sato's team found a hollow compartment. Inside was a weather-beaten black leather ledger. The moment Sato opened it, he knew the world would never be the same. The pages were a meticulously handwritten chronicle of horror. Names, dates, coordinates, and the cost of disposal. But it was the names and the margins that caused his blood to run cold. High-ranking ministers, police chiefs from the 90s, and even members of the judiciary. The Tokyo 1992 cold case wasn't just about a missing student. It was a thread that, when pulled, would unravel the entire fabric of the Japanese establishment. The news of the Black Book's recovery leaked before Sato could even secure it in the evidence locker. The city erupted. Protests began in Shinjuku, the very place where Akari's body had been found. Thousands of people held up photographs of their own missing loved ones from the bubble era, demanding to know if their fathers, sisters, or sons were also part of the city's foundation. The community was rocked by a collective realization. They had been living in a graveyard of progress. The cold case had become a mirror, reflecting a side of the national identity that had been suppressed for decades. The atmosphere was no longer just suspenseful. It was revolutionary. The people were no longer afraid of the ghosts. They were becoming them. But the establishment wasn't going down without a fight. As Sato drove the ledger to the prosecutor's office, his car was forced off the road by a fleet of black SUVs with tinted windows. The fixer's reach extended far beyond Mori's prison cell. A high-speed pursuit tore through the rain-slicked streets of Tokyo, a cinematic clash between the old guard of corruption and the new era of truth. Sato, bleeding from a gash on his forehead, clutched the Black Book to his chest like a holy relic. He wasn't just a detective anymore. He was the guardian of Akari's legacy. He managed to reach a local news station, a manhoi KY law in itself, choosing the transparency of the airwaves over the safety of the precinct. He walked into the live studio, the ledger in hand, and as the cameras turned on, he began to read the names. One by one, the titans fell. The mother of the marginalized watched from her cell as her empire crumbled in the light of the television screen. The fixer, in his tea room, closed his eyes, a final, cryptic smile playing on his lips as the first of the politicians named in the book resigned in disgrace. The discovery of Akari Tanaka had triggered a domino effect that reached the very top of the Tokyo skyline. But the cost was high. The more Sato read, the more he realized that the missing student was just the first page of a much longer, much darker story. The coordinates in Sapporo were still being excavated, and the reports coming back were grimmer than anything they had found in Osaka. It wasn't just individuals. It was entire families who had been erased to make room for the skyscrapers. The mystery was solved in the eyes of the law, but the psychological wound on the city was deepening. The landmark was gone, replaced by a site of national mourning. The Tokyo 1992 cold case had become the Great Reckoning. As Part 3 comes to a close, the rain begins to wash the blood from the streets of Shinjuku, but the water is dark, stained by the secrets of a generation. Sato stands in the TV studio, the lights blindingly bright, and he realizes that the Black Book has one final page, a page that hasn't been written on yet. It's a list of the disappeared of the future. The conspiracy didn't end in 1992. It just evolved. The construction of the city never stops, and as long as there is progress, there will be those who are willing to bury the truth to achieve it. The case is no longer about finding a killer. It's about surviving the revelation of who we really are. The screen flickers, the signal momentarily interrupted by a surge of traffic to the news site. The world is watching. The air is thick with the electricity of a changing era, and the ghost of Akari Tanaka finally seems to find a moment of peace. But as the camera zooms on the final name in the ledger, a name that Sato hasn't read out loud yet, the expression on his face changes from determination to pure, unadulterated shock. The name isn't a politician. It isn't a CEO. It's someone much closer to home. The landmark may have been demolished, but the foundation of lies is deeper than anyone ever imagined. The name at the end of the Black Book didn't just shock Detective Sato, it paralyzed him. Under flickering studio lights of the news station, the ink seemed to bleed into the paper, forming the name of his own mentor, the late Superintendent Arida, the man who had taught him how to be a cop, the man who had comforted Akari's mother 30 years ago. The betrayal was a physical blow, a revelation that the very hand meant to seek justice had been the one holding the shovel. The Tokyo 1992 cold case wasn't just a failure of police work. It was a masterpiece of internal sabotage. Sato looked into the camera, his silence speaking louder than any confession. The city held its breath as he tucked the ledger into his coat and walked out of the studio, leaving the news anchors in a state of stunned disbelief. The hunter was now the prey, and the precinct he had called home for 40 years had become a nest of vipers. As Sato vanished into the Shinjuku night, the focus shifted north to the Sapporo excavation. If Shinjuku was a tomb and Osaka was a warning, Sapporo was a factory of death. The luxury residential tower, a gleaming spire of glass and steel, sat atop a foundation that defied every building code in existence. When the specialized deep scan sonar hit the basement levels, it didn't return a solid signal. It returned a honeycomb. The Manhoi KY La strange clues from the dark web had predicted this. The red cellar, deep beneath the frost-hardened earth, investigators found a labyrinth of reinforced concrete chambers that were never on the blueprints. These weren't graves. They were holding cells. The Ishida conglomerate hadn't just been burying their victims. They had been processing them. The discovery sent a fresh wave of horror through the community. The cold case had cracked open a door into a dark, industrial underworld where people were traded like commodities before being integrated into the city's infrastructure. Forensic teams in Sapporo recovered belongings from the red cellar. Watches, glasses, a child's toy, all preserved in a morbid, oxygen-free environment. The missing student, Akari Tanaka, had been the catalyst that exposed an assembly line of human erasure. The shock to the community had turned into a full-blown national trauma. Every citizen began to look at their surroundings with suspicion. Was the local school built on a secret? Was the hospital foundation reinforced with the bones of the disappeared? The very concept of home was being dismantled in real time. Sato, now a fugitive from his own department, realized he couldn't go back. He needed to find the man in the gray coat one more time, but not in a prison cell. He needed to find the man's shadow. Through a series of high-stakes contacts in the Tokyo underworld, Sato tracked a lead to a derelict industrial park on the edge of the bay, the site of a defunct Ishida cement plant. The atmosphere was thick with the smell of salt and decay. As he moved through the rusted skeletons of the silos, he felt the weight of the 34-year-old mystery pressing down on him. This was where the star of Shinjuku began. This was where the concrete was mixed with the blood of the innocent. In the heart of the plant, he found it, the final ledger. If the Black Book was a list of the dead, this was the list of the living, the silent partners who still benefited from the Ishida empire. And among the names was a signature that made Sato's heart stop. A sitting member of the High Court, the very judge who was slated to preside over Sayuri Ishida's trial. The conspiracy wasn't a ghost of the 90s. It was a living, breathing monster that controlled the present. The missing student found buried was just a bait to draw out the last of the honest cops. The landmark was a lure. The realization hit Sato just as the first black SUV pulled into the yard. They weren't there to arrest him. They were there to finish what they started in 1992. A high-stakes standoff erupted in the ruins of the cement plant. The silence of the base shattered by the crack of gunfire. Sato, cornered behind a rusted mixer, looked at the final ledger. He knew that if he died here, the truth would be buried under the very concrete he was standing on. But he wasn't alone. The power of the internet, the amateur sleuths who had been tracking the case, had followed his digital footprint. A fleet of civilian drones, equipped with high-definition cameras and live-streaming capabilities, descended from the sky like a swarm of mechanical angels. The man in the gray coat, modern successors frozen in the glare of 1 million live viewers. The cold case solved headline began to evolve into the fall of the Titans. The live stream from the cement plant was being watched by half the population of Japan. Every move the corrupt officers made, every word they spoke, was being broadcast directly to the public. The conspiracy was being dismantled by the one thing it couldn't control: total transparency. The community, once paralyzed by fear, began to converge on the site. Thousands of cars clogged the highways leading to the bay, a sea of headlights cutting through the darkness. The people were no longer waiting for the law to act. They were becoming the law. As the sun began to peek over the horizon, illuminating the grim reality of the industrial park, the high-level corruption was laid bare. The judge resigned within the hour. The superintendent's involvement was confirmed by digital records recovered from the plant servers. The missing student, Akari Tanaka, had finally done what no one else could. She had brought the entire system to its knees from beyond the grave. Her locket, her note, her scratched-in coordinates had been the keys to a kingdom of shadows. But the cost of this victory was etched into the faces of everyone involved. Sato stood in the center of the yard, the final ledger in his hand, as the first rays of light hit the rusted steel. He was exhausted, broken, and alone, but for the first time in 34 years, he felt the weight lift. The Tokyo 1992 case was no longer cold. It was a searing, white-hot fire that consumed the lives of a generation. The landmark was gone, the body was found, and the killers were in chains. Yet, as he looked out over the bay, he knew that the dew echoes of the case would last forever. The missing student was home, but the city she returned to was changed beyond recognition. The high society mastermind, Sayuri Ishida, sat in her cell and watched the sunrise on a small monitor. She knew the end had come. The architecture of silence had collapsed. But as the camera zoomed in on her face, she whispered one final, chilling line to the guard. "You think you cleaned the foundation, but you've only just started digging. Do you know how many landmarks we built in the 80s? The screen went black, leaving the audience with a terrifying realization. The Ishida Empire was just one of many. The Tokyo 1992 case wasn't the end of the mystery. It was the opening of a Pandora's box that would take decades to close. The mystery of Akari Tanaka was solved, but the ghost of the city remained. The neon pulse of Shinjuku continued, but the lights felt dimmer, the shadows longer. The community was left with a haunting question. In a city built on secrets, who can you really trust when the ground beneath your feet starts to speak? The case was closed, but the nightmare had just moved to a different neighborhood. The 1980s in Tokyo weren't just a decade. They were a fever, a gold-plated hallucination where the price of a single square meter in Ginza could buy a kingdom. And the city's skyline rose so fast the concrete never had time to cool. It was the era of the golden blood, a time when the Ishida conglomerate and their rivals didn't just build offices, they built monuments to their own divinity. But as the Tokyo 1992 case bled into the headlines of 2026, the chilling words of Sayuri Ishida from her prison cell began to act as a map to a much older, much deeper circle of hell. If the 90s were about covering up mistakes, the 80s were about the ritualistic foundation of power itself. Detective Sato, now a man without a badge but with a target on his back, found himself standing in a rain-drenched alleyway in Roppongi, meeting the only person the system hadn't yet managed to break, Detective Kaito Ren. Ren was a ghost in the machine, a cybercrime specialist half Sato's age, with eyes that had seen too many deleted files and too many accidental data wipes. He didn't look like a hero. He looked like a man who hadn't slept since the Shinjuku sarcophagus was opened. He handed Sato a decrypted drive, his hands trembling slightly against the backdrop of the neon-lit puddles. The 90s records were just the tip of the iceberg, Sato-san, Ren whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the city. I went back further, to the 1985 Waterfront Initiative. The blueprints aren't just missing, they were never filed. There are dead zones in the city's seismic sensors, areas where the ground is too dense, too artificial. It's not just Akari. It's not just a few journalists. We're looking at a lost generation of the Foundation. The investigation pivoted with a violent jerk from the tragic to the industrial. The Manhoi Keiwaila, strange clues, now pointed to the Ginza Zenith, a skyscraper that defined the 1986 skyline. Ren's data revealed a terrifying pattern. during the construction of the Zenith's 4-story subterranean parking garage, the disappearance rate of day laborers in the Sanya district, Tokyo's invisible slum, spiked by 400%. These were the men with no families, no records, the ghost laborers, who were trucked in at midnight and never seen again. The community, already reeling from the Akari Tanaka revelation, now faced a darker truth. Their most prestigious shopping districts were built on a literal mountain of a nameless. The Ginza cold case was no longer a theory. It was a mathematical certainty. Sato and Rin became a duo of shadows, moving through the archives of defunct labor unions and bankrupt subcontractors. They found the blue diaries, the handwritten notes of a retired site foreman who had taken his own life in 1989. The entries were the ramblings of a man losing his mind to guilt. The concrete hums at night. One page read, "It's not the wind, it's the breath of the 12. They told us it was the stability of the empire. They told us the gods demanded a sacrifice for the height of the tower. 12. The number echoed in Sato's mind. It wasn't just random murder. It was a structured, a cult-like adherence to the Heido Basher myth, modernized to the age of high-frequency trading and bubble economics. The atmosphere in Tokyo turned from shock to a suffocating paranoia. If the 1992 case was a SOC Tsongdong community shock, the 1980s revelations were a total collapse of social trust. People began to avoid the landmark district. Real estate prices in the historic Ginza Zenith plummeted as rumors of the humming concrete spread through social media. The missing student found buried was a spark, but the 80s Project X was a powder keg. Sato and Rin tracked the 12 mentioned in the diary to a specific poor date, October 12, 1986. That night, a freak typhoon had hit Tokyo, providing the perfect cover for a massive, unauthorized concrete delivery to the Zenith site. A delivery that originated from a private Ishida plant that officially didn't exist. As they dug deeper, the man in the gray coat reappeared in the 80s records, but younger, more feral. Kenzo Mori wasn't just a fixer then. He was the chief architect of Erasure. Rin managed to recover a corrupted video file from a discarded VHS tape found in the foreman's estate. The grain was heavy, the colors bled, but the image was clear. A line of men blindfolded, being led into the darkness of a foundation pit. Behind them stood a young Sayuri Ishida, watching with cold, aristocratic curiosity. This wasn't a corporate cover-up. It was a blood sport. The Tokyo 1992 case was merely the tail end of a decade-long spree of industrial slaughter. The duo's hunt led them to the Old Vault, a forgotten bunker beneath the Tokyo Bay Bridge. According to Ren's decrypted maps, this was the central hub for the 80s structural sacrifices. The air inside the bunker was stagnant, smelling of salt water and ancient, drying lime. As they moved through the darkness, their flashlights cut through the dust to reveal the walls. They weren't smooth. They were textured with the shapes of hands, shoes, and faces, a grotesque gallery of the 1980s boom. This wasn't just a grave. It was an altar. The missing posters from 40 years ago were no longer just paper. They were the residents of this concrete hell. Cold case turned national massacre. Manhoi Kiwaila leads to the heart of the Ginza elite. SOC Tsongdong, as the city's foundations begin to scream. The pressure from the silent partners reached a fever pitch. Sato's apartment was firebombed. Ren's digital identity was erased within seconds. They were men who officially didn't exist, hunting a truth that the city was desperate to keep buried. But the Duem echoes of the dead were louder than the threats of the living. A group of survivors, the children of the ghost laborers, began to organize their protest marches clogging the streets of Shinjuku. They didn't want money. They wanted the Ginza Zenith dismantled. They wanted the bones of their fathers returned from the stone. The Tokyo 1992 cold case had ignited a class war that had been brewing for half a century. In a desperate move to silence the investigation, the current government declared the Old Vault a site of biological hazard, cordoning it off with military-grade security. But Ren had already uploaded the VHS footage to a decentralized server. The world saw the faces of the 12. The world saw the young Sayuri Ishida. The mother of the marginalized was now the goddess of the grave. The psychological impact was devastating. The landmarks that had once been symbols of Japanese pride were now seen as monuments of shame. The landmark found buried wasn't just a headline. It was the epitaph of the bubble era. Sato, standing on a rooftop overlooking the Ginza zenith, felt a sense of vertigo that had nothing to do with the height. He looked at the glowing windows of the tower, where oblivious office workers were still finishing their shifts, sitting mere meters away from the 12 trapped in the walls. The city was a beautiful, glittering mask stretched over a face of pure horror. The Tokyo 1992 case was solved, but the 1980s reckoning was just beginning. Justice was no longer a courtroom. It was a sledgehammer. The foundations had to come down, even if it meant the city had to fall with them. The tension in the air was thick enough to taste, a metallic, sharp tang of impending disaster. Rin looked at his screen, his face illuminated by the data of 1,000 more disappeared names. "It's not just the Ishida family, Sato," he whispered. "Look at the signatures on the 1984 dredging permits. It's everyone, every major house, every political dynasty. They all have a pillar. They all have a guess in concrete." The Tokyo 1992 cold case was a thread that had unraveled the very fabric of the nation's identity. The community wasn't just rocked. It was being terraformed by the truth. As the rain turned into a torrential downpour, washing the grime of the present into the scars of the past, Sato realized the true meaning of Mori's words. The city would crumble if the secrets were removed, not because of the structural integrity of the buildings, but because of the moral integrity of the people. To acknowledge the dead in the walls was to acknowledge that their entire modern existence was a gift from a graveyard. The missing student, Akari Tanaka, was just the first voice in a choir of thousands that was finally starting to sing. The screen of Ren's laptop flickered, displaying a final, encrypted message from an unknown source. It wasn't a threat. It was a set of coordinates for the National Diet Building, the heart of the Japanese government. The message was simple. The first stone was laid in 1936. The tradition is older than you think. The Tokyo 1992 case had led them to a door, and behind that door was a hallway that stretched back a century. The cold case was no longer a mystery to be solved. It was a curse to be endured. The coordinates on Ren's screen didn't just point to a location. They pointed to the soul of the nation. 35.6759 degrees north, 139.7448 degrees east. The National Diet Building. The granite fortress where the laws of Japan were written, where the Prime Minister stood, where the fate of millions had been decided for nearly a century. If the Ishida conglomerate and the 1990s conspiracy were the infection, this was the patient zero. The Tokyo 1992 cold case had started with a missing student in a plaza, but it had dragged Detective Sato and the renegade cyber sleuth ran into the dark, beating hard at history itself. The message was clear. The first stone was laid in 1936. The tradition is older than you think. The silence in the safe house was absolute, broken only by the hum of the servers and the distant, rhythmic wail of sirens that seemed to be closing in from every direction. This wasn't a crime scene anymore. It was an archaeological dig into a national nightmare. Sato stared at the map, his mind reeling. The Diet Building was constructed between 1920 and 1936, a period of rising militarism, shadows, and an obsession with imperial permanence. If the Haido Bashira, the human pillar, tradition was real, if it had been industrialized by the Ishida family in the 80s, then the Diet was a temple where the practice had been sanctified. The Manhoi Ky La, strange clues, they had followed were crumbs leading to this loaf of stone. Ren's fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing modern firewalls to access the digitized archives of the Imperial Ministry of Construction, files that had been declassified by mistake or forgotten in the transition to the digital age. What he found wasn't a blueprint. It was a ritual scroll masked as an engineering log. The term structural guardian appeared 17 times in the foundation documents for the Central Hall. 17, not rebar, not pylons, guardians. The revelation shifted the ground beneath their feet. This wasn't just corruption, it was a cult, a secret lineage of power brokers who believed, with terrifying sincerity, that the state could only stand if it was rooted in blood. The shock to the community, that began with Akari Tanaka, was about to become a seismic event that would crack the legitimacy of the entire government. Sato knew they couldn't just walk into the Diet with a shovel. They needed undeniable proof, a smoking gun from 1936 that linked the past to present. They needed the Imperial Register, the original list of the 17 souls who had been fed to the foundation of Japanese democracy. The trail led them to the outskirts of Kamakura, to a dusty, book-cluttered estate owned by the grandson of the Diet's chief architect. Professor Yamashita was a man living in the twilight of his own memory, surrounded by the ghosts of an era he had only read about. When Sato showed him the symbol from the Black Ledger, the stylized eye of the Ishida cult, the old man didn't flinch. He wept. "You have found the veins," he whispered, his voice trembling like a dry leaf. "My grandfather died screaming about the walls. He said they weren't building a parliament. They were building a crypt." Yamashita handed him a decaying, leather-bound journal, the pages brittle and yellowed. Inside were the sketches, detailed, architectural drawings of the Diet Central Tower, but with anatomical cross-sections. In the hollows of the great stone pillars, figures were drawn in the fetal position. Beside each figure was a name, a date, and a purpose. For strength, for silence, for obedience. The connection was absolute. The cold case of Akari Tanaka was a modern echo of this ancient rite. The Ishida family hadn't invented the practice. They were the hereditary keepers of it. They were the high priests of a secret religion that worshipped stability above humanity. The names in the 1936 journal weren't criminals or homeless drifters. They were dissidents, political rivals, poets who wrote the wrong words. The Diet building wasn't just a seat of government. It was a prison for the opposition, sealed in stone forever. The mystery had evolved into a horror story of epic proportions. The very walls that protected the lawmakers were built on the bones of those who had dared to question the law. As Sato and Rin raced back to Tokyo with the journal, the city seemed to change around them. The shadows of the buildings felt longer, the neon lights harsher. The Duam echoes of the past were screaming. The government, sensing the final breach, initiated a level black protocol. The internet in the Kanto region began to throttle. Social media platforms went dark. The great firewall of the state was coming down to trap the truth. But Run had anticipated this. He had set up a dead man switch, a broadcast signal routed through a constellation of unauthorized satellites. The moment the net went dark, the signal would blast the contents of the 1936 journal to every screen, every billboard, every digital surface in the city. The confrontation took place not in an interrogation room, but in the shadow of the Diet building itself. It was 4 a.m., the witching hour of the metropolis. Sato stood at the gates, the journal in his hand, facing a phalanx of riot police and private security contractors wearing the insignia of a subsidiary of the Ishida Group. The rain was torrential, washing the city in a gray, weeping gloom. "Let us pass," Sato roared, his voice cracking with the weight of the 17 names in his pocket. "The people have a right to know who is holding up the roof." The commander of the guard, a man whose face was hidden behind a black visor, stepped forward. He didn't raise his weapon. He lowered it. "My grandfather," the commander said, his voice distorted by the helmet, "disappeared in 1936. His name was Kenji. Is he in the book?" The question hung in the air, a fragile bridge between the enforcers and the truth seekers. Sato opened the journal to page 42. Kenji Oda, 24 years old, carpenter, for endurance. He held the page up to the floodlights. The commander stared at the sketch of the man trapped in the pillar, a man who shared his blood. The silence that followed was louder than the thunder rolling over Tokyo Bay. The cold case had just disarmed the state. The commander turned to his men, his hand raising in a fist. "Stand down," he ordered. "Let them through." The gates of the National Diet building, closed to the uninvited for 90 years, groaned open. Sato and Ren walked into the belly of the beast. The central hall was a cavernous, opulent space, filled with statues of great men and the scent of history. But now it smelled of something else, fear. They didn't go to the chambers. They went down past the basement archives, down past the maintenance tunnels, into the sub-foundation, a level that didn't exist on any modern map. There, in the damp, Cold dark, they found it, the first pillar. It wasn't hidden behind plaster or wood. It was exposed, a massive, rough-hewn block of granite that formed the anchor of the entire structure, and embedded in the stone, preserved behind a thick pane of 1930s industrial glass, was the face of a young woman, not a Kari, someone from a different time, wearing the tattered remains of a Taisho-era kimono. She was a mother of the parliament, the first sacrifice. The plaque beneath the glass was simple, chilling, and written in an archaic script. Here lies a silence that allows a voice to speak. The shock to the community was total. The live stream from Ren's camera hit the world. The image of the girl in the foundation of the Diet building was burned into the retinas of 1 billion people. The Tokyo 1992 mystery had unmasked the Tokyo 1936 atrocity. The Manhoi KY law was no longer a clue, it was a verdict. The legitimacy of the government vaporized in an instant. The Prime Minister, watching for his residents, knew that no speech could cover this. The building itself was a crime scene. But as Sato stared into the dead eyes of the girl in the glass, he noticed something that froze his blood. In her hand, clutched tight against her chest, was a small metallic cylinder. It looked modern, too modern for 1936. He leaned closer, wiping the condensation from the glass. The cylinder had a serial number, type 99, 1999. The timeline shattered. The girl was from the 30s, but the object was from the future relative to her death. Or the glass had been opened. The first pillar wasn't just a grave, it was a vault. Someone had been down here recently. Someone had added to the collection. Rin scanned the cylinder with his portable analyzer. Sato, he choked out, that's not a relic. That's a biological containment unit, and the seal is broken. The cold case twisted again. The sacrifices weren't just for superstition. They were guarding something. The Hido Basher were the lock, and the bodies were the tumblers. What had they been hiding inside the foundation of the government? And where was it now? The sound of heavy boots echoed in the tunnel behind them. They weren't alone. The true masters of the legacy, the ones above Ishida, above the politicians, had arrived to protect the source of their power. A voice echoed from the shadows, smooth, cultured, and terrifyingly familiar. It was the voice of a man who had been dead for 10 years. Or so the world thought. You have an annoying habit of digging up the seeds before they sprout. Detective Sato. Out of the darkness stepped the former prime minister, the man who had supposedly died of a stroke in 2016. He was alive. He was down here. And he was holding the missing contents of the cylinder. The Tokyo 1992 case had led them to the deep state, a shadow government that used the disappeared not just as structural support, but as biological currency. The confrontation in the sub-foundation was the clash of two realities, the old detective with his truth, and the undead leader with his power. Akari Tanaka was a necessity, the former prime minister said, stepping into the light of the camera. She saw the delivery. She saw us bringing the new guardian to the star of Shinjuku. You think we stopped in 1936? We build a new pillar every decade. It's the only way to keep the thing inside the earth asleep. The mystery had gone from criminal to eldritch. The thing inside the earth? The conspiracy wasn't just about politics. It was about containment. Sato raised his gun, his hand steady despite the trembling of the world around him. What is in the cylinder? He demanded. The former prime minister smiled, a cold, thin expression that mirrored the skull beneath the skin. Not what, detective? Who? The Hido Bashara aren't dead. They are in stasis. They are the batteries for a machine you cannot comprehend. And you just woke them up. The ground beneath the Diet building began to shudder. Not an earthquake, a heartbeat, a massive subterranean pulse that shook the dust from the ceiling. The girl in the glass opened her eyes. The cold case was over. The awakening had begun. The community outside, the millions watching on screens, saw the lights of the National Diet building flicker and die, plunge into a darkness that felt alive. The missing student found buried was just the first key. Now, the door was wide open, and the city of Tokyo was about to meet the monster it had been built to hide. The rumble beneath the National Diet building wasn't magic. It was mechanics. The heartbeat Sato felt wasn't a pulse of blood, but the rhythmic thrum of a massive subterranean generator cycling up, a machine built of iron, oil, and organic matter. The former prime minister didn't look like a wizard casting a spell. He looked like a weary engineer monitoring a failing engine. "You think this is a ghost story, detective?" he sneered, his voice cutting through the dust falling from the ceiling. "It is a physics problem. Tokyo sits on the intersection of 3 tectonic plates. We didn't build the diet here because it was grand. We built it here because it is the keystone, and keystones require wetware." The girl in the glass didn't step out. As the seal on the Type 99 cylinder hissed open, the air rushed in, and 30 years of suspended animation collided with the harsh reality of the present. Her eyes, which had fluttered open, suddenly clouded over. The stasis wasn't life. It was a chemical preservation of neural activity. She wasn't waking up. She was expiring. With a sound like dry leaves being crushed, the body inside the first pillar began to disintegrate, the ancient flesh turning to dust in seconds. The machine let out a screeching, metallic groan. The battery was dead, and the needle on the wall-mounted seismograph slammed into the red. "You fool," the prime minister hissed, his calm facade cracking. That cylinder contained the enzymatic stabilizer. It kept the biological processors viable. You haven't just solved a cold case. You pulled the plug on the city's dampening system. The deep state conspiracy was laid bare. The Haido-Bashra weren't religious sacrifices. They were components in a massive, pre-war seismic weapon designed to neutralize earthquakes, a tectonic pacifier powered by human nervous systems. Akari Tanaka hadn't been murdered because of a business deal. She had been selected as a replacement part for a failing node in Shinjuku, and when she died during the procedure, they buried her in the concrete to hide the failure. Ren grabbed Sato's arm. "We have to go. Now." The live stream was still running, but the signal was degrading as the electromagnetic field in the basement spiked. The world had seen the girl turn to dust. They had heard the prime minister confess to turning citizens into biological mortar. The shock to the community was now a global panic. The narrative of the missing student had mutated into a biopunk nightmare. The government wasn't just corrupt. It was harvesting its own people to fight the earth itself. Sato didn't want to leave. He raised his gun, aiming at the prime minister. "Who else?" he roared. "How many nodes?" The old man laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "Look at the skyline, detective. The Tokyo Tower, the Sky Tree, the Rainbow Bridge. Every major structure is a needle in the earth, and every needle needs an eye. You want to save them? You can't. They are the city." The floor buckled. A fissure snaked across the concrete, separating Sato from the prime minister. Steam vented from the pipes, hot, sulfurous, smelling of the deep earth. "Run!" Rin screamed, pulling Sato toward the maintenance shaft. They scrambled up the rusted ladder just as the sub-foundation began to flood with black, oily water rising from the borehole. Below them, the former prime minister didn't try to escape. He walked toward the failing machine, adjusting the dials, a captain going down with his ship of bones. He was trying to manually stabilize the tectonic plates, buying the city a few more hours of life with his own existence. They burst out of the Diet Building's service exit into the chaotic pre-dawn light. The scene was apocalyptic. The police cordon had broken. The riot squads were retreating, not from the protesters, but from the building itself. The ground was vibrating with a low-frequency hum that made teeth ache and glass rattle. It wasn't an earthquake yet. It was the absence of the dampener. The tension in the earth, held back for 90 years by the machine, was beginning to push back. Rin checked his phone. The feed had cut, but the damage was done. Sato looked at the news. The headlines were screaming, "Diet Building crumbling, biological weapon confirmed, evacuate Tokyo." The Manhoi KY Law's strange clues of the Akari Tanaka case had led to the revelation that Tokyo was a ticking time bomb. The cold case investigation had inadvertently disarmed the safety mechanism of the metropolis. The guilt hit Sato like a physical blow. By seeking the truth, had he doomed the city? They stole an abandoned news van, Ren hacking the ignition with a frantic speed. As they peeled away from the government district, the radio crackled with emergency broadcasts. Seismic alert, magnitude undetermined, epicenter, everywhere. The sarcophagus in Shinjuku, the red cellar in Sapporo, the zenith in Ginza, they were all connected. The black book wasn't just a list of victims. It was a circuit diagram, and Sato was the one who had cut the wires. "Where are we going?" Ren asked, swerving to avoid a fissure that had opened in the middle of the highway. Sato looked at the final ledger. He still clutched in his hand. There was one location they hadn't visited, one set of coordinates that was different from the rest. It wasn't a building. It wasn't a bridge. It was a natural formation. Mount Fuji. The entry in the book read, Project Genesis, the master switch. If there was a way to reset the system, to stop the chain reaction without sacrificing another human soul, it was there. But they weren't the only ones heading for the exit. The sky above Tokyo was suddenly filled with the roar of helicopters, not news choppers, military gunships. The Ishida private army had been deputized by the remnants of the shadow government. Their orders were simple: sterilize the leak. Sato and Run were now the most wanted men in history, driving a stolen van through a city that was trying to shake them off its back. The voiceover takes a darker, more urgent tone. The leisurely pace of an investigation is gone. This is a survival run. The mystery of 1992 is dead. The survival of 2026 is the only case left. Sato looked in the rear-view mirror. The National Diet building, the symbol of order, was tilting, just a fraction of a degree, but enough to scream that the era of silence was over. Akari Tanaka had found her voice. It was loud enough to bring down the sky. As the van sped toward the expressway, leaving the crumbling skyline behind, Sato realized a terrifying truth. The missing student wasn't the victim. She was a warning, and the city wasn't a habitat. It was a cage, and the cage was opening. The Chua Expressway, usually a river of red taillights and commercial logistics, had become a gauntlet of twisted metal and panic. Detective Sato slammed the stolen news van into gear, the engine screaming as he weaved through the debris of a collision that had just happened seconds before. Behind them, the Tokyo skyline was a silhouette of disaster, the great towers swaying a rhythm that defied the wind, a seismic dance conducted by the failing machine beneath the Diet. But the threat wasn't just the earth, it was the sky. The thumping rotor blades of 3 black helicopters cut through the roar of the crumbling city. The Ishida private security forces had been given this zero option, total erasure. They weren't trying to stop the van. They were trying to turn it into a fireball. Ren sat in the passenger seat, his face illuminated by the blue glow of his laptop, his fingers a blur. He wasn't looking at the road. He was diving into the Project Genesis files, the encrypted root directory of the entire conspiracy. Sato turned left. "Take the Hakioji interchange," he shouted, his voice cracking. "The main route is rigged. The seismic sensors on the bridge ahead are spiking. They're going to blow the supports to trap us." Sato wrenched the wheel, the van drifting dangerously close to the guardrail before tearing down the off-ramp. A second later, the overpass they had been aiming for disintegrated in a cloud of dust and concrete, a controlled demolition disguised as structural failure. The deep state wasn't just chasing them. They were weaponizing the infrastructure itself. As they sped into the darkness of the mountain roads, leaving the burning city behind, the Manhoi KY La strange clues of the landscape began to shift. The trees along the roadside weren't swaying. They were vibrating. The air smelled of ozone and sulfur, a thick metallic taste that coated the throat. Ren finally broke the encryption on the Genesis file, and the color drained from his face. "It wasn't an invention, Sato," he whispered, staring at a grainy photograph from 1923. "The machine. The dampener. They didn't build it. They found it." The image showed a team of Imperial surveyors in a lava tube beneath Mount Fuji, standing next to a colossal, geometric structure made of black, non-reflective material. It predated the chaotic sprawl of modern Tokyo. It predated the empire. It was an anomaly, a geolock left by something or someone else. The realization changed everything. The Haido Bashra ritual wasn't superstition. It was a user manual. The humans weren't sacrifices to gods. They were compatible biological keys needed to interface with this ancient alien technology. The Tokyo 1992 murder of Akari Tanaka was a botched attempt to replace a fuse in a system the government barely understood. And now, the system was rejecting its masters. The Project Genesis facility at the base of Fuji was a research lab. It was a temple to this unknown engine. And the master switch wasn't a reset button. It was the original interface. A spotlight blinded them from above. One of the helicopters had anticipated the detour. Bullets chewed up the asphalt inches from the van's tires. Sato killed the headlights, driving by the light of the moon in sheer instinct, plunging the van into a dense Forest Service road. The suspension groaned, the chassis slamming against rocks, but he didn't lift his foot from the gas. "We have to get to the sea of trees," Rin directed, reading the map. The facility is hidden under the Aokigahara forest. The magnetic interference there hides the facility's signature. It's the only place the drones can't see us. They crashed through a rusted chain-link fence, the van skidding into a clearing dominated by the looming, snow-capped shadow of Mount Fuji. But it wasn't the majestic mountain of postcards. It was a dark, brooding monolith, the ground around it steaming. The cold case had led them to the gates of hell. The facility entrance was disguised as a geothermal power station, but the security was military-grade. Concrete bunkers, electrified fences, and automated turrets. Yet, the gates were open. The guards were gone. The evacuation had already happened. The silent partners had fled, leaving the machine to run wild. Sato stopped the van. The silence of the forest was unnatural. No birds, no wind, just the low-frequency hum of the earth, louder here than in Tokyo. He looked at Run. The young hacker was trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of what he held. "If we go in there," Rin said, "we aren't just fighting the Ishida family. We're fighting the mountain." Sato checked his gun. He had 3 bullets left. 3 bullets against a tectonic apocalypse. "Akari didn't get a choice," Sato said, opening the door. "We do." They moved toward the facility, the do-em echoes of the 1992 case following them like ghosts. The corridors of the station were empty, bathed in emergency red light. The walls were lined with the same Type 99 cylinders they had seen in the diet, but these were empty, used up, discarded. This was the graveyard of the Guardians. As they descended into the core of the mountain, the temperature rose, the air became hard to breathe, and then they saw it, the Genesis engine. It was vast, suspended over a magma vent, a terrifying fusion of 1920s industrial steel and the sleek black alien geometry seen in the photo. But it was screaming. Arcs of blue electricity jumped from the pylons, grounding themselves in the rock. And in the center, in the master interface, was a final, empty slot, a slot shaped perfectly for a human form. The machine was starving. It needed a final component to stabilize the reaction before the fault line snapped and swallowed Tokyo whole. "It's an exchange," Rin realized, his voice hollow. "It's not a switch. It's a trade, life for land. To stop the earthquake, someone has to get in." The shock to the community was nothing compared to the shock in that room. The Tokyo 1992 investigation had ended with a moral ultimatum. The corruption wasn't just about greed. It was about the terrible math of survival. The government had been feeding people to the machine to save millions. And now, the machine was asking for one more. Sato looked at the empty slot. He looked at the data Run was holding, the truth that would destroy the government forever. He looked at his own hands, aged and scarred by decades of chasing lies. The man in the gray coat was gone. The prime minister was dead. There was no one left to make the sacrifice. No one but them. The cold case was about to become a closed case in the most permanent way possible. But before Sato could step forward, a shadow detached itself from machinery. A figure emerged from the steam, holding a weapon that looked more like a mining tool than a gun. It wasn't a guard. It was Kenzo Mori. The fixer hadn't been in prison. The man in the cell was a body double, a decoy. The real Mori had been here all along. the keeper of the flame, the warden of the volcano. He looked ancient, his skin waxy, his eyes burning with a fanatic's light. You tracked the ghost all the way to the tomb, detective, Maury rasped, raising the weapon. But you misunderstand the ritual. The machine doesn't just take anyone. It takes the willing. The final standoff wasn't in a courtroom. It was on a catwalk, suspended over a lake of fire. The Tokyo 1992 mystery had stripped away the city, the law, and the time, leaving two old men and a terrified hacker at the edge of oblivion. The ground shook violently, knocking Wren to his knees. A crack appeared in the containment glass of the engine. The countdown had begun. The heat rising from the Genesis engine was a physical weight, a wall of superheated air that smelled of ozone and ancient burning iron. On the catwalk suspended over the magma vent, Kenzo Mori stood like a wraith, his silhouette flickering against the blinding blue arcs of the machine. He didn't raise his weapon to fire. He held it like a scepter, a symbol of his office as the warden of the underworld. The ground beneath him buckled, a violent spasm that sent a tremor through the entire mountain range. The roar of the tectonic plates grinding together was deafening, a sound that wasn't heard with the ears but felt in the marrow of the bone. The Tokyo 1992 cold case had stripped away the facade of civilization, leaving only this primal confrontation at the edge of the world. You look at this machine and you see a crime, Maury shouted over the din, his voice thin and reedy but cutting through the noise with terrifying clarity. I see a dam holding back a flood of fire that would consume 10 million people in a heartbeat. Do you think we wanted to do it? Do you think the Ishida family enjoyed the blood? He took a step closer, his eyes locked on Sato. We were the only ones willing to pay the rent for the land you walk on. Sato gripped the railing, his knuckles white. The Manhoi KY La. Strange clues of the locket, the note, the coordinates. They all pointed to this moment. Akari! Sato screamed back, the name tearing from his throat. Why her? Why a student? If this is about duty, why didn't you throw yourself in the pit 30 years ago? Maury's face contorted, a mass of anguish cracking the waxen composure of the fixer. He lowered the weapon, his hand trembling, because the machine requires a compatible frequency, a biological resonance. It runs on potential, on life that hasn't been lived yet. He reached into his coat and pulled out a photo, not the one from the tea room, but an older, crumpled picture of a woman holding a baby. Akari wasn't just a random selection, detective. She was the only one who could stabilize the core in 1992 because she carried the blood of the Guardians. She carried my blood. The revelation hit Sato like a physical blow. The missing student wasn't a stranger to Maury. She was his daughter. The man in the gray coat hadn't just buried a victim. He had buried his own child. The horror of it was absolute. The cold case wasn't just a murder. It was a filicide committed in the name of the greater good. Maury had sacrificed his own flesh and blood to keep the neon lights of Tokyo burning for another 30 years. The SOC Tsongdong community shock that had gripped the nation was nothing compared to the void that opened up in that chamber. This was the true cost of the city's skyline. I watched her die, Maury whispered, the words lost in the screech of the failing engine. I held her hand while the cement was poured. I wrote the note. I promised her that the city would keep her. And it did. It kept her safe until you dug her up. He looked at the empty slot in the machine, the interface that was screaming for a new occupant. And now you've broken the seal. The debt is due again. The facility shook with a violence that threw Run to the grating. Debris began to rain from the cavern ceiling, massive chunks of rock splashing into the magma below. The Genesis engine was going critical. The blue lightning turned a sickly, violent violet. The dampening field was collapsing. Above them, in the world of the living, the ground would be liquefying. The buildings of Shinjuku, the towers of Ginza, they were seconds away from becoming rubble. Fix it. Rin screamed, scrambling to his feet, clutching the data drive that contained the evidence of the century. You built it. You fix it. Maury looked at the young hacker, then at Sato. A strange calmness settled over him, a final acceptance of a destiny he had been running from since 1992. I cannot fix it, he said softly. I can only feed it. He looked at the weapon in his hand, then tossed it into the abyss. It spiraled down, melting before it even hit the lava. The machine needs a will. It needs a soul that accepts a burden. Akari didn't have a choice. That was my sin. But I have a choice. He turned to the interface. The master switch. It wasn't a chair or a pod. It was a field of energy, a vortex of raw power that required a human conductor to close the circuit. Maury looked back at Sato one last time. "Tell them," he said, his voice regaining the steel of the fixer. "Tell the world what the Foundation is made of. Let them hate me. Let them tear down the statues. But tell them I kept the lights on." With a sudden, fluid motion, Kenzo Mori stepped into the violet light. There was no scream, no struggle. As his body made contact with the interface, the air in the cavern seemed to implode. A blinding flash of white light washed out the shadows, the heat, and the noise. For a second, silence reigned, absolute, ringing silence. Then the machine roared, not a sound of failure, but of engagement. The violet lightning snapped back to a stable, humming blue. The vibration in the floor ceased instantly. The Genesis engine had accepted the payment. The circuit was closed. Sato shielded his eyes, gasping for air as the pressure in the room normalized. Where Mori had stood, there was nothing, no body, no ash, just a humming arc of energy, pulsing with a rhythm that matched the heartbeat of the city. The man in the gray coat had become the ghost in the machine, the new guardian of the fault line. He did it. Rin breathed, staring at the stable core. He actually did it. But the mountain wasn't finished with them. The stabilization process triggered a venting sequence. Alarms began to blare, echoing through the cavern. Purge cycle initiated. Atmospheric venting in T-minus 60 seconds. The facility was flushing the heat. If they stayed, they would be cooked alive. "Move!" Sato grabbed Ren, dragging him away from the railing. They sprinted back across the catwalk, the metal groaning under the stress of the rapid cooling. Steam geysers erupted from the floor, scalding the air. They scrambled up the service ramp, lungs burning, legs heavy with exhaustion. They weren't just running from a facility. They were running from the truth of what they had just witnessed. The Tokyo 1992 case had been solved, but the solution was a horror that no court could prosecute. They burst through the heavy blast doors of the control room, just as the vents behind them roared open, blasting superheated steam into the chamber where Mori had vanished. They stumbled into the cool night air of the forest, collapsing onto the frozen ground of the Aokigahara. The snow pressed against Sato's face, cold and real. Above them, the sky was silent. The helicopters were gone, retreated, or recalled. The ground was still. The earthquake hadn't happened. Tokyo was safe. The millions of people in their apartments, the commuters on the trains, the children in their beds. They would never know that they had been seconds away from extinction. They would never know that the monster they feared was the only thing standing between them and the fire. Sato rolled onto his back, staring up at the stars through the canopy of the suicide forest. He clutched the final ledger in one hand and Akari's locket, which he had taken from evidence, in the other. The father and the daughter were reunited now, bound together in the circuitry of the earth. The cold case was closed, but as he listened to the wind moving through the trees, Sato knew that the silence was a lie. The city was still standing, but it was standing on a grave. "Run," Sato whispered, his voice raspy. "The drive, the data." Ren sat up, clutching the laptop. The light from the screen illuminated his face, pale and streaked with grime. "I have it. I have everything. The names, the dates, the blueprints, the video of the sacrifice." "Upload it," Sato said. "All of it." Ren hesitated. "If I do this," the panic, the chaos, people will know their homes are batteries. The government will fall. The economy will collapse. It might destroy the city anyway. Sato sat up, looking toward the distant glow of Tokyo on the horizon. A city built on lies. A city that demanded blood. "Let it fall," he said, his eyes hard. "A foundation built on secrets is already broken. We don't save the city by hiding the cracks. We save it by showing them." Ren nodded. He hit the enter key. The progress bar on the screen raised from 0% to 100%. The Manhoy KY La was no longer a secret. It was a signal. The data packet, encrypted with the highest clearance, shot up to the satellite and rained down on every server, every news desk, every smartphone in Japan. The part 10 of the saga begins not with a bang, but with a notification sound, a distinct ping that echoed from Ren's phone, then Sato's, then, in the distance, the faint, collective chime of a million devices waking up at once. The truth had landed. The cold case was over. The reckoning had arrived. The sound that destroyed modern Japan wasn't the roar of the Genesis engine or the grinding of tectonic plates. It was a synchronized digital chirp of 120 million smartphones, receiving a push notification at the exact same second. In the freezing silence of the Aokigahara forest, Detective Sato and Ren watched the screen of the laptop, the upload bar sitting at a static, completed green line. But down in the valley, in the sprawling, neon-veined organism of Tokyo, the reaction was a rolling wave of confusion that rapidly mutated into absolute, unbridled horror. The file Ren had released wasn't just a document. It was a total transparency protocol. It hijacked every digital billboard in Shibuya, every ticker in the stock exchange, and every emergency broadcast system in the country. The face of the missing student, Akari Tanaka, appeared on the giant Q-front screen, towering over the famous crossing, followed immediately by the classified footage of her death, the blueprint of the Haido Bashira nodes, and the final, grainy video of Kenzo Mori stepping into the machine. The Tokyo 1992 cold case didn't just break the news cycle. It broke reality. For the first few minutes, the city was paralyzed. Commuters on the Yamanote line stared at the screens above the doors, watching the former prime minister confess to industrial-scale murder. Shoppers in Ginza dropped their bags as the audio of the 1980s 12 crying for help played over the district's PA systems. The shock to the community was visceral, a physical nausea that swept through the population. This wasn't a scandal about money or bribes. This was a revelation of the ground beneath their feet, the towers they worked in, the bridges they crossed. Everything was a necropolis. The Manhoy KY La strange clues were no longer mysteries. They were the bricks of their daily lives. The psychological contract between the state and the citizen, the promise that the government exists to protect the people, was incinerated in an instant. Then the silence broke. It started with a scream in Shinjuku, near the site where the star Shinjuku had once stood. Then another, then the sound of shattering glass. The SOC Tsongdong community shock turned into a firestorm of rage. The people didn't run away. They ran at the symbols of their oppression. The Ishida conglomerate headquarters in Marunouchi was besieged within the hour. Thousands of people, armed with nothing but grief and fury, stormed the lobby. They weren't looting. They were tearing the building apart with their bare hands, ripping the marble from the walls as if searching for the bones hidden behind them. The police, the riot squads who would normally have crushed such an uprising, stood down. They, too, had seen the files. They, too, saw their own station houses listed on a node map. The chain of command evaporated because the commanders were exposed as accomplices to a century-long massacre. From their vantage point on the mountain, Sato and Run could see the change in the city's light. The organized, grid-like glow of the metropolis was fracturing. Fires were starting, not from the earthquake, but from the riots. Pillars of smoke rose to blot out the moon. "We didn't save the city," Rin whispered, his face pale in the laptop's glow. "We just changed the way it dies." But Sato shook his head. "No, we woke it up. A nightmare only ends when you open your eyes." The cold case was solved, but the verdict was being delivered by a jury of millions in the streets. The international reaction was swift and panicked. The Genesis files were being downloaded in Washington, Beijing, London. The revelation that Japan possessed a tectonic weapon, even one designed for defense, changed the geopolitical map overnight. Foreign embassies in Tokyo began emergency evacuations, helicopters lifting off from rooftops like fleeing insects. The yen plummeted to zero in minutes, the Tokyo Stock Exchange erasing trillions of dollars of value as the algorithms realized that the assets, the real estate, the infrastructure, were all cursed inventory. The bubble-era economy, which had been on life support for decades, was finally pulled off the respirator. The wealth of a nation, built on the golden blood of the sacrifices, turned to dust. Inside the chaos, the silent partners, the politicians, judges, and CEOs named in the Black Book, tried to run. But Wren's total transparency included real-time tracking of their assets and locations. The amateur sleuths and internet detectives who had followed the Akari case became a digital lynch mob. Flight plans were leaked. Safe houses were doxed. The high society mastermind class found that their money was useless when the entire banking system had flagged them as hostis homini generis, enemies of a human race. At Haneda Airport, a private jet belonging to the Ishida estate was surrounded on the tarmac by baggage handlers and mechanics who refused to refuel it. The elite were trapped in the very cage they had built. As the night deepened, the focus of the mob shifted to the landmarks. The Rainbow Bridge, identified in the files as a major node containing 3 Guardians from 1993, was blocked by a human chain. People weren't destroying it. They were covering it in flowers. Thousands of bouquets, candles, and photos of the missing were laid against the pylons. The Haido Bashira were no longer anonymous batteries. They were recognized as martyrs. A strange, spontaneous vigil began to spread across the city. At the Tokyo Tower, at the Sky Tree, at the Diet Building, the violence of the riots gave way to a solemn, weeping reverence. The city was holding a funeral for itself. Sato and Rin drove back down the mountain in silence. The roads were empty of police, but filled with people walking away from the city or walking towards it, drawn by the gravity of the truth. When they reached the outskirts of Tokyo, the sun was beginning to rise. The light didn't hit a gleaming, futuristic metropolis. It hit a city that looked like it had survived a war. Smoke drifted through the avenues. Glass paved the streets. But the machine beneath the earth was silent. The ground was steady. Kenzo Mori's sacrifice held. The Genesis engine was humming its blue, stable note, powered by the will of the man who had started it all. They abandoned the van near a subway station and walked into the heart of Shinjuku. Sato, the disgraced detective, the fugitive, walked with his head high. No one stopped him. No one recognized him as the man from the news. They were too busy looking at the missing posters that had been plastered over every surface. Not just Akari's, but thousands of new ones printed from the Black Book. The names of the lost generation were finally on display. The man in the gray coat was gone, but his legacy was everywhere. They reached the site of the Star of Shinjuku, the empty pit where the story had begun. It was no longer a construction site. It was a shrine. The fence had been torn down. People were standing at the edge of the crater, throwing origami cranes into the darkness. Sato stood next to Rin, looking down into the earth. "It's over," Rin said, his voice cracking with exhaustion. "We burn it all down." "Not all of it," Sato replied, pointing to the east. The sun was breaking over the horizon, illuminating the battered, scarred, but still standing skyline. The buildings are still there. The people are still here. The lie is dead. Now they have to figure out how to live with the truth. But the Tokyo 1992 case had one final twist, one last Manhoi KY law to deliver. As the new day began, reports started coming in from the hospitals. Patients in comas, people with inexplicable neurological conditions, the sensitive ones who had always complained of headaches near the major landmarks. They were waking up. They were healing. The dampening field of the machine hadn't just suppressed earthquakes. It had suppressed human consciousness, a subtle, low-frequency fog that had kept the population docile and numb for 90 years. With Mori in the machine, the frequency had changed. The heavy atmosphere of Tokyo lifted. The colors seemed brighter. The sound sharper. The city wasn't just waking up from a lie. It was waking up from a trance. Sato felt it too. The weight in his chest, the cynical fog that clouded his mind since 1992, was gone. He took a deep breath of the smoky air. It tasted like ash, but it also tasted like freedom. He looked at the final ledger in his hand. There was one page left. The page he hadn't shown Rin. The page that listed the next candidate. He pulled out his lighter. He didn't read the name. He didn't want to know. The cycle had to end. He held the flame to the corner of the book. The paper caught, curling into black flakes. The black book, the list of the dead, the map of the bodies, turned to smoke and drifted up into Shinjuku sky, joining the spirits of Akari, the 12, and 1,000 of others. What do we do now? Ren asked, watching the ashes fly. Sato turned his back on the pit. He turned his back on the police force that would never exist in the same way again. He looked at the young hacker who had helped him break the world. Now, Sato said, a faint, tired smile touching his lips. Now we have breakfast. And then we watched the new foundation dry. The aftermath wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a history that wouldn't be written in concrete, but in light. The Tokyo 1992 cold case was closed. The file was deleted. But the scar it left on the world would never fade. The missing student was found, but in finding her, Tokyo had lost its innocence and found its soul. The camera pulls back, rising high above the city, higher and higher, until the people are just specks and the buildings are just stones. But the city is glowing, not with neon, but with a strange, ethereal blue light pulsing from the ground, the heartbeat of the volunteer in the mountain, keeping watch over the chaos below. The ashes of the black book didn't just disappear. They became part of the smog, a microscopic grit that settled in the lungs of 12 million people. As the sun climbed higher over the fractured skyline of Tokyo, the city didn't look like a disaster zone anymore. It looked like a cathedral the morning after a miracle. The riots had burned themselves out, replaced by a stunned, reverent silence that blanketed the metropolis like snow. The police sirens had stopped. The stock tickers were blank. The only sound was the wind whistling through the canyons of glass and steel, a wind that no longer carried the heavy, suffocating weight of the dampening field. For the first time in a century, the air in Tokyo was clear. It was crisp. It tasted of ozone and the deep, metallic tang of the earth, a reminder that the machine beneath the mountain was running, fed by the soul of a man who had spent his life in the shadows, so the city could live in the light. Detective Sato stood on the edge of the Shinjuku crossing, the busiest intersection in the world, now eerily empty of cars, but filled with a sea of pedestrians. They weren't rushing to work. They were walking slowly, heads down, or looking up at the skyscrapers with a mixture of awe and terror. They were seeing the guardians now. Every pillar, every pylon, every foundation stone was no longer just concrete. It was a tomb. The total transparency leak had done its work. People were placing hands on the walls of the station, closing their eyes, trying to feel the vibration, trying to send a silent apology to the lost generation trapped inside. The Tokyo 1992 case had transformed the city into a massive, open-air memorial. The missing student found buried under the landmark was no longer a victim. She was a patron saint of the truth. Ren had vanished into the digital ether, his job done. He had wiped his own existence from the databases along with the government's secrets, becoming a ghost in the new world he had helped create. But Sato remained. He was the anchor. He walked through the crowd, an old man in a rumpled coat, the only one who truly understood the price of the ground they stood on. He passed a group of teenagers spray painting a mural on the side of a department store. It wasn't graffiti. It was a portrait of Akari Tanaka, her eyes bright and defiant, surrounded by a halo of blue lightning. Underneath, in jagged kanji, they had written, "The city keeps you." The phrase Mori had written on the death note had been reclaimed. It was no longer a threat. It was a promise. We know you are here. We will not forget. The aftermath wasn't a collapse of society. It was a restructuring of the soul. The government fell, of course. The prime minister's cabinet resigned en masse within hours of the leak. The Ishida conglomerate was dissolved, its assets seized not by the state, but by a citizens' tribunal formed in the chaos. But the infrastructure remained. The train still ran, driven by engineers who now whispered prayers before starting the engines. The lights still glowed, powered by the grid that connected to the mountain. The people accepted the bargain. They understood now that their safety was purchased with blood, and that knowledge changed them. The arrogance of the bubble era, the blind pursuit of progress, was gone. In its place was a humble, terrifying gratitude. They lived on the back of a beast, and they had to walk softly. Sato made his way to the small apartment complex in the suburbs where Akari's parents still lived. The media had surrounded the building earlier, but they were gone now, chased away by neighbors who had formed a protective ring around the old couple. Sato didn't knock. He stood at the gate, looking up at the window. The curtains were drawn, but a single candle flickered on the sill. They knew. They had seen the files. They knew their daughter hadn't just been murdered. She had been used to save the world. It was a cold comfort, a horrific honor, but it was the truth. Sato bowed low, a deep, waist-bending bow of apology and respect that he held for a long minute. When he straightened up, the curtain moved slightly. A hand raised in acknowledgement. It was enough. The cold case was closed. The family had their answer. The waiting was over. He took the train to the coast, to the reclaimed land of Odaiba, where the view of the city was panoramic. He sat on a seawall, watching the sun begin to set. The skyline of Tokyo, usually a glittering jewel box, looked different tonight. The lights were coming on, but they seemed softer, less frantic. And there was something else, a faint, rhythmic pulse in the atmosphere. The Genesis engine at Mount Fuji was stabilizing the tectonic plates, but the energy it released was creating a subtle aurora effect over the city. A pale, indigo shimmer hung over the skyscrapers, the color of the golden blood, the color of the guardians. It was beautiful. It was haunting. It was a visual manifestation of the ghosts watching over the living. The investigation was finished, but the story of Tokyo was just beginning a new chapter. The man in the gray coat was now the man in the mountain. Kenzo Mori's sacrifice had bought them time, perhaps another century, perhaps just a decade. But the master switch wasn't infinite. Someday, the machine would hunger again. Someday, the blue light would fade, and the earth would demand another volunteer. But that was a problem for the future. For now, the city breathed. It inhaled the night and exhaled the past. The missing student found buried had unearthed a reality that was stranger than any fiction, a world where science and sacrifice were indistinguishable. Sato reached into his pocket and pulled out his badge. The metal was cold, worn smooth by 40 years of service. It belonged to a police force that had protected the lies. It belonged to a system that was now dead. He looked at it for a long moment, watching the reflection of the indigo sky on the brass. Then, with a flick of his wrist, he tossed it into Tokyo Bay. It hit the dark water with a barely audible splash and sank, joining the secrets in the silt. He wasn't a detective anymore. He was just a man living in a city of bones. As night fell completely, the sounds of the city returned, but they were different. The roar of traffic was deeper, more resonant. The chatter of the crowds was hushed. It was as if everyone was listening to hum of the subway rails, listening to the wind between the towers, listening for the voices of the 17 original sacrifices in the Diet, the 12 in the Ginza Zenith, the hundreds in the bridges and tunnels. The cold case had taught them how to hear the dead, and the dead were saying, "Live, live well, we are holding the roof up for you." The camera pans up from Sato's solitary figure on the seawall, rising above the bay, drifting over the Rainbow Bridge where the flowers are piled high. It glides over the ruins of the Ishida headquarters, over the dark, empty pit in Shinjuku, over the glowing spire of the Tokyo Tower. It moves faster now, blurring the lights into streaks of time, rushing toward the west, toward the looming shadow of Mount Fuji. The mountain is silent, majestic, capped in snow. But deep inside, down in the magma chambers, the blue light pulses. Thump, 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 the heartbeat of the city. The voiceover drops to a whisper, intimate and chilling, speaking directly to the listener's soul. They say that in Tokyo, you are never more than 3 meters from a rat. But the truth is darker. In Tokyo, you are never more than 3 meters from a grave. We walk on them. We drive on them. We build our dreams on the rib cages of the forgotten. The case of Akari Tanaka is solved, but the mystery of the city is eternal. We found the body, but we can never remove the stain. And maybe we shouldn't. Maybe we need to remember that civilization is a fragile thing, a thin layer of concrete poured over a chaotic earth, held together not by steel, but by the will of those who are willing to stay behind in the dark. So the next time you are in Shinjuku and you feel the ground shudder beneath your feet, Don't be afraid. It's not an earthquake. It's not the end. It's just them. It's the guardians, shifting their weight, adjusting the load, tightening their grip on the tectonic plates so that you can sleep. Akari is there. The journalist is there. The workers are there. And the man in the gray coat is watching over them all. The case is closed. The file is burned. But the city never forgets. And neither should you. The screen fades to black. The blue pulse lingers for a second longer, like an afterimage on a retina. Then silence. Absolute, heavy and final. End of script.